My name is Thomas Grayson. I was 32 the night it started, October 14th, 2019. I remember the date because my sister had insisted I come home for her birthday dinner the next week. She joked that if anything strange happened, I could at least be on time for cake. I thought then I was only moving back into a town that smelt of river salt and diesel, a town with a history printed on its brickwork and a dozen whispered legends stitched into the docks. I didn't know how fast Port Huron would make me someone else's cautionary tale. Port Huron, for anyone who's never driven the stretch of I-94 that rolls in like a slow reveal, sits where the St. Clair River finishes its long, muddy work and finally hands itself to Lake Huron. The Blue Water Bridge cuts the sky with concrete bones, and the lighthouse by the mouth has that lean, melancholic face of every small city that's watched sailors and storms for a century. My parents bought a narrow Victorian on Lakeshore Avenue, cedar shingles that sighed in wind, a porch that leaned like an apology. The house was cheap because of the small-town quirks, as the agent called them. The older men in the diner called them the town's temper, and the teenager who fixed my starter laughed and said the place had personality. All of these were true in a way that seemed innocent when you're young and moving back after years away. I grew up leaving Port Huron behind. I left for a job in Grand Rapids, then Chicago, then a skyline that never went to sleep. I'd been gone 8 years. When my company folded, when the rent notices came like small, precise knives, I told myself I was going home to regroup. That's where the plot begins. Not with a creak in the night, not with a single scream, but with practicalities. Boxes, the smell of old paper, the financial arithmetic that makes you swallow pride. I told my mother I'd stay 6 months. She made meatloaf and asked about my teeth. My sister June, a nurse with a steady laugh and a soft, no-nonsense voice, put me on her emergency contact list and said, "Thomas, don't let yourself become a cliché." Port Huron is a town that wears its past openly. There are plaques for the steamship disasters, for the long coal yards, for the immigrant families who built the brick streets. There's Perkins House, a peeling manor on the hill, and the old train depot where kids dare each other across the tracks. There are stories that become part of the morning, like the lady who walks the seawall and the man who still checks the abandoned lighthouse at dusk. Folks trade tales like they trade fishing tips. You're expected to know them by the second year. I learned the local myths quickly, the story of the fog that swallowed a fisherman whole, the tale of a soldier who never came back from the shipyards, the rumor about the small pocket of neighborhood that no one could explain the electricity bill for. It was always higher, always flickering, and everyone assumed a busted meter. Locals called it the Hollow, a block where lights burned cold and pets avoided. When I asked casually at the hardware store, the man behind the counter gave me a long look and suggested I ask June instead. Characters in small towns often come with stage directions attached. There was Margot from the library who stacked her hair like a crown and ran a book club that read old sea journals. There was Sheriff Allen with his slow drawl and an empathy that had been chipped by 15 winters. There was Eli Montgomery, a fisherman by trade, one of those men who never met a shoreline he didn't want to rearrange. Eli lived 2 streets down from me and waved like we were family from the moment I lifted a box over my head. He warned me, half joking, about the Hollow. "Mind the nights when the river goes wrong," he said, and then changed the subject to the price of bait. Before the real thing started, before doors moved without anyone nearby and my phone filled with static, there were small signs, like the first notes in a song that's about to break. My neighbor's porch light went out every night at 2:17 exactly. Pet birds in the neighborhood grew sullen and refused seeds. 2 of the kids who skateboarded under the bridge reported someone walking on the water and were laughed out of the rec center. I thought these were the usual small-town superstitions, the nocturnal complaints of people who named their trees and argued with the mailman. I had a rational mind by training. I had data, spreadsheets, a habit of explaining the unexplainable. That habit would be a poor shield. On the day in early October, 3 weeks before the October 14th date I keep repeating, a storm crawled up the lake and parked a low cloud over the town. The wind smelled of cold irons and wet rope. I was reopening my father's old workshop to see what tools remained when I found a stack of postcards in a toolbox. They were from 1927, handwritten notes to a woman named Lillian, ink that had browned like dried tea. The postcards described a man missing at sea, a promise to return, a mention of the light that keeps calling. I felt a small, sharp thing in my chest, curiosity clothed as coincidence. I learned later that the Graysons had always been a seafaring line, men who left and came back in pieces. The town is full of such graves of memory. We walked past them every day and called them things like heritage. June and I argued once about whether houses hold on to sorrow. She said, "A place is just wood and stone, Tom." I said, "A place remembers what we don't." At the time, it felt like a private philosophy exercise between siblings. Afterwards, it felt like a forewarning. I should say now, before the part you came here for, the part where the shadows do the talking and doors aren't doors anymore, that I didn't go into that night looking for ghosts. I went in because the house had lost power 2 nights in a row, and because the dog at the corner of Lakeshore had started whimpering into the street. I'm practical. I checked wires, fuses, the meter. I found nothing. The electrician, a man named Hal with a scar down the left forearm, shrugged and said, "Town's got quirks." He disappeared after that. People leave Port Huron for many reasons. Some leave because their trade dries up, some because the river calls them, and some because the house wants them gone. The main story begins in earnest on the night of October 14th, 2019. That's when the town revealed its patient, waiting face. I had gone to bed with the window cracked because the house smelled of old paper and lake. Rain came in thick at 2:12 a.m., the kind that sounds like someone reading a long, slow name into a book. I woke at 2:17, the same time the neighbor's light always died, because something moved inside the house that wasn't wind. At first, it was a soft, deliberate tapping, like a careful knuckle at the base of the wall. Then the tapping became footsteps that knew the same hollow rhythms as my own. The hallway light flickered, my breath, a lamp in winter, puffed out small, visible clouds. I reached for my phone. Static filled the screen before it lit. The radio in the kitchen, an old portable that had belonged to my father, hummed, not with music, but with a voice that sounded like 2 people speaking at once, overlapped, underwater. It said my name. I stood there in that thin, bright rectangle of bedroom light and felt the house inhale. The sound wasn't just noise. It was memory itself, unpacking and setting its boxes down in the open. The calendar on the wall, the postcards, June's laugh in the kitchen from earlier that week, they all packed themselves into one small, terrible present and pressed against the chest of the house. The footsteps came closer. I opened the bedroom door. The hallway was empty. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. I stepped into the hallway and the house answered with a long, thin silence, the kind that settles when an animal has heard something far off. The floorboards under my feet were dry and ordinary, nothing like the heavy, damp tread I'd expected. The radio's murmur in the kitchen folded into itself and died. For a moment, I stood there, a man in a sweater in his childhood home, feeling ridiculous and exposed. I told myself to breathe like a grown-up. I checked the lock on the front door, the deadbolt, the windows, every hinge and latch, because habits are a good defense against the uncanny. I flicked on the lamp by the staircase. The light poured up, warm as a hand. Nothing moved. The house had made a sound and then chosen discretion. I went back to bed, but sleep was a thin thing that fled like fish. I lay awake listening to the rain and cataloging explanations. Raccoons in the eaves, a loose board settling, some neighbor's late-night prank. By morning, the town wore its usual sleepy face. My mother fussed over my coffee, and June brought a plate of pancakes and an eye full of skepticism. "You in the house," she said between syrup and clatter. "Maybe you miss drama, Tommy." Her voice had the steady, unclenchable rhythm of someone who had seen blood and bad nights and kept working anyway. I wanted to tell her everything. I told her nothing. The postcards from 1927 were folded beneath the radio like a trapdoor. Lillian's handwriting, the mention of the light that keeps calling, the phrase, "He won't stay away from the river." The words made my mouth dry. Eli stopped by that afternoon. He brought over 2 beers and the kind of smile that asks for nothing and expects the same. He smelled of diesel and the river. "You get any more of your nocturnal visitors?" he asked, sliding onto my porch like a man who knew how to sit. I tried to make light of it. Eli got serious, his eyes losing the friendly sheen. "You heard of the Hollow, Tom?" he asked. I nodded. I'd heard the stories. "Not all quirk. Some things in Port Huron are like rust. They get in and they don't leave. You mind the seawall at night for a while. Keep your doors shut tight." He left the door open on his way out, and the wind carried a smell of wet rope into the kitchen. The next week, I started to collect evidence like a man learning a new language. The kind librarian Margot pulled out yellowed copies of the Port Huron Times from the archive. She wore thin gloves and treated the papers like people. We read aloud in the reading room, the two of us low-voiced and conspiratorial, the sunlight catching dust motes like tiny ghosts. There were reports from the 20s about a fisherman lost in fog, a dispute over lighthouse keepers, an inquest into a man named Amos Grayson, who had disappeared and whose last letter had been to a Lillian Grayson at a Lakeshore Avenue address. Each article piled onto the next until history felt less like past and more like a drawer I had opened and could not close. Sheriff Allen humored me when I went in with clippings. He had a desk that smelled faintly of aftershave and old coffee. He went through the motions, note-taking, frowning, and then told me that sometimes small towns fold the dead into their furniture. "Buildings remember, Tom. Folks remember. That doesn't mean the dead are stepping out for a walk." He believed in practical answers and, I think, in protecting the living from the shape of fear. He did not come to my house at night. Things escalated in ways that tried patience. Electronics misbehaved. My laptop would play a single note on repeat, a note that sounded like a bell tuned by someone underwater. The kitchen clock, an old wind-up thing I had wound out of habit, stopped at 2:17 every morning. My neighbors began to talk in quieter circles at the bus stop. June called one night, her voice clipped. "Tom, your porch light was on all evening. The dog at the corner wouldn't cross your yard." The dog was an odd detail I couldn't fit into logic. One evening, I walked down to the seawall, drawn by the same reckless curiosity that gets teenagers onto train tracks. The river was wide and the bridge lights blinked their slow mechanical Morse. The fog rolled like a carpet, low and deceptive. Someone had scrawled an old name into the concrete. Amos. Shallow letters worn by time. I sat on the stone and thought about the postcards. Men go missing at sea. Their wives wait until waiting becomes a profession. But the thing that came to visit me didn't seem interested in closure. It wanted company. On my way back, I found footprints in the sand where none should be. Prints that led close to my house and then vanished as if swallowed by the porch. They were boot prints, large and heavy, but they carried the trace of salt as if someone had stepped straight out of the river. I followed them to the porch and noticed, for the first time, that the single imprinted shoe I'd found beneath the stairs months before, the one I assumed belonged to a previous tenant, was gone. A cold stitch tightened around my ribs. The town's quiet looked suddenly like a mouth that could open. That night, the house became a chorus. Doors that had been shut whispered open in the dark, not with the slowness of a broken hinge, but with the precise, inevitable rhythm of someone walking room to room. I set my phone on the table in the living room and recorded an adult acting like a ghost hunter. The recording caught nothing at first but a low hiss. Then at 2:17, a voice spoke so close to the phone that the waveform on my screen spiked and folded. It wasn't so much words as syllables, the broken grammar of waves. Tom, Lillian, water, home. The voice carried a softness like someone trying not to wake a child, and beneath it, a thrum like distant engines. I leaned into the voice like someone leaning into a wound. The house felt like a throat closing. On the porch stood a figure for a breath. Pale against the porch light, the suggestion of a coat. And then it wasn't there. My mouth tasted of metal. I went out to the yard in slippers and found nothing but a single scrap of paper pinned beneath a rock, a page torn from a book with a line of a poem about lighthouses and leaving. The edges were damp. Sleep stopped being an option after that. I worked by day, answering emails, pretending to settle normal things like banking. By night, I drove the shoreline and tried to catch some other town's attention. The more I resisted, the more the house asked for my company. Objects moved with an aim I couldn't name. The postcards rearranged themselves with dates I hadn't seen before. The radio played a lullaby from no station I could find. Once, in the blurry hour before dawn, I woke to the smell of sea salt and tobacco and found the back door open and footprints leading not to the river but toward the hollow. I began to talk to people in a way that broke decorum. I told them about the voice on the radio. I told them about the footprints, the postcards, the missing shoe. Faces that had once been friendly cooled with the kind of pity towns reserve for people who have looked too long at graves. Eli slammed his palm against his knee and said, "You gotta stop looking, Tom. Some things aren't for fixing." I told him that once someone dies, it's okay to dig. He stared at me like I was a stranger. That night, I put the postcards in a box and locked them in the trunk of my car. I told myself that was a rational step. It was not rational. By 1:58 a.m., the trunk creaked. At 2:04, the radio in the kitchen burst on and played a single note, the color of deep water, and the house seemed to move toward the sound. I grabbed the box and ran outside. At the edge of the yard by the gutter that led to the sewer, a pale handprint glowed on the concrete. Not wet, but luminous in the way things look when you remember them. The print was small, like it belonged to a child. Beneath it, someone had scratched a name, Lillian. I remember thinking, in a calmness that felt foreign, that the town keeps its stories like it keeps its summers, carefully until someone forgets to water them. And when someone forgets, the stories lean across the fence to the living and ask to be remembered. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The handprint on the concrete did something to the quiet. It took the ordinary rhythm of the night and set a slow, steady tremor under it, like wind at the edge of a cliff. I crouched and pressed my palm to the exact spot. The concrete was cool and clean, as if no one had walked there for a long time. My fingers slid into grooves that felt older than the house, older than my family's tenure on Lakeshore Avenue. I wanted to laugh, to say I'd staged it, but the laugh caught in my throat and came out small and animal. I brought the postcards into the kitchen and spread them on the table under the yellow light. Lillian's looping script flickered in the bulb's warmth like a living thing. One postcard, the one that mentioned the light that keeps calling, was damp at the corner, as though it had been sealed with someone's tears. I kept thinking about the single missing shoe, about the footprints that seemed to arrive from the river and then disappear. Things that come from the water carry a patience I don't have. Water waits. June came over that day. She sat with me at the table and looked at the postcards the way a surgeon looks at a wound. "Tom," she said finally, "this is getting worse." She took my hand and squeezed, an action half comfort and half attempt to steady me. "I can move in for a few nights. We'll lock the doors. We'll put lights on timers." I told her not to. Pride and the shame of asking for refuge from something that might be my own imagination. But she stayed anyway. Her presence was a kind of armor. We went to the library where Margot let us into the archives after hours. The building smelled of glue and mildew, and somewhere in the stacks, a furnace hummed like a contented beast. Margot produced a thin, leather-bound volume from under a loose shelf, the lighthouse keeper's log, hand-lettered in a rigid, careful hand. The pages were splattered with salt and thyme. We read by flashlight because the library claimed energy savings and decency both. The keeper's entries were mundane at first, weather, ship movements, foghorns. Then they changed tone in the fall of 1927. October 12th, Margot read with an even voice. Fog heavy. Amos Grayson reported absent. L. Grayson waits at shore. Light fades at 2:15. I thought the lamp was low. I burned extra oil. The date matched Amos's last postcard. My stomach rolled like a small boat. The log went on, October 14th. Lillian writes to say the light called her. Amos walked into the river. We could not pull him back. Lillian stood on the seawall until dawn. The careful script fractured on that page, ink blotting into a shape that might have once been a name. "That's the night," June whispered. "The 14th. The calendar on my phone flashed the same date I'd memorized. The keeper's log ended in shorthand and a smudge of what might have been tears. There was no formal record of a body recovered, only a thin line about search parties and a town that preferred its losses folded neatly under other business. I started to see the town differently after that, not as a place with quaint history, but as a ledger where names were ticked off and moved on. The hollow made more sense in that light. If people had gone into the river and not come back, if a lighthouse had been seen as a mouth instead of a beacon, then perhaps the hollow was not a place but a posture, a way the town leaned toward memory and stayed there. Sheriff Allen came by again, not with a badge or paperwork this time, but with an old man's patience. He told me about rumors of a family pact, a buried promise to keep tragedies private. Old towns do this, he said. They keep the sad in the basements because the rest of life wants to carry on. He also told me quietly that in the 60s there had been another cluster of disappearances near the mouth of the river. Not all things tie up in a neat knot, he added. He didn't say how many names were missing. He didn't have to. The ledger had more blank pages than I wanted to read. The presence in the house became more specific. It no longer hid behind the anonymity of taps and static. It wanted to talk. At 2:17 one night, the clock stopped, and a voice, not through the radio this time, but in the room with me, said plainly, "You left me." It was a sentence that could have been a sentence to anyone, the kind of reproach a lover might give in the middle of an argument. My hands went cold. I answered out loud before I could stop myself. "Who are you?" The voice no longer had the distance of a broadcast. It corrected me with a name, Lillian. Once a name is given, it has gravity. The room shifted. I could smell the sea in the curtains as if the lake had been set to steep there. Shadows pooled in corners like onyx tea. I felt simultaneously like a thief and a trespasser. If Lillian was a person who had once watched a man walk into the river and never leave, then she was also a woman who had chosen, for reasons I could not fathom, to keep attending the places where the living met the dead. June read me a theory one night over takeout, a mixture of psychology and superstition. She suggested grief could imprint on places, that human attention is a kind of energy. It sounded like an academic paper and like witchcraft at once. I wanted an explanation that could be measured and boxed. Instead, I got a handprint in the concrete and visits that smelled of salt. The town shifted too. People who had previously smiled at me in the grocery store now stared with a complicated sympathy that made me feel like sickness had a face. Eli grew distant. He'd come over one afternoon and stand on the porch, looking at the river as if it might answer a question only he could frame. "You should leave, Tom," he told me, blunt as ever. "Not because it'll stop, because staying is a kind of bait." He said it like a fisherman telling you to avoid a reef. The next escalation came from the hollow. Lights there burned a cold white, the kind of light that doesn't warm anything. I drove down one evening at dusk, more a historian than a man in danger. The hollow was smaller than I'd pictured, a block of houses with peeling paint and stubborn porches. One house had its windows boarded, and someone had painted the words "Do not turn on" in thick, childish letters across the boards. I should have taken that as an omen and left. Of course, I didn't. A woman in a threadbare cardigan, maybe in her 70s, stood in the doorway and watched me. She had a knitted cap and eyes that looked like they had been made of many legislated sorrows. "You're Thomas Grayson," she said without preface. Her voice had a rasp that suggested she'd been a singer once and had forgotten some notes. "You've been waking the house." She invited me in the way some people invite a guest inward to prove something to themselves. Inside, the house smelled like old tea and mothballs. The living room had a child's chair in the corner, a toy boat with faded paint, and a mantel overloaded with photographs. The woman pointed to a photograph of a thin man in a coat, standing at the water's edge. "Amos," she said. "People like Amos walked into the water because they couldn't stand what had happened on the land." She spoke slowly, as if translating history into small words. But Lillian, she waited. She lifted a finger. She waits better. On my way out, she pressed into my hand a folded scrap of paper. It was a fragment of a letter addressed to Lillian. "Keep the light burning. Promise me you'll keep watching." The handwriting was the same curl as the postcards. The woman's name was Ruth. She said nothing more, only watched me go with eyes that asked for the promise the letter demanded. When I arrived home, the house felt like a room I had left in a hurry. The radio was humming in the kitchen, and the postcards lay spread on the table, edges wet and curling like seashells. Only one card had been added, a modern postcard with a color photograph of the Blue Water Bridge and written across the back in a hurried hand, "Help me find Amos." No stamp, no name. I thought absurdly that I could outlast this. I would call people, I would get help, I would close the book. Instead, the house invited me onto the porch and led my feet along the path it had always walked. The hollow hummed like a hive in the distance, and the river moved with an authority that made me feel very small. That night, the dream came. I was a child again, standing behind Lillian on the seawall. The fog folded across us like a blanket. Lillian's hand was warm at my shoulder, and behind her the river opened like a mouth. She looked at me and said in a voice colored with salt, "You should come down to the water." He never left. I woke with my sheets soaked in sweat, the taste of iron on my tongue. I kept thinking of the scrap of paper in the woman's eyes and the logbook's last blurred entry. The town wanted something from me, not in a way I could bargain with money or time. It wanted me to remember and to carry remembering forward. Remembering in Port Huron is not an act, it's an inheritance. I did not want that weight, but the town had a way of pressing its hands on you until something inside you took the shape of its need. On the fourth night after the dream, at 2:17, I heard footsteps on the porch. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The footsteps on the porch were slow and exact, measured like a man who had learned to keep time with the sea. I slid from bed with the kind of automatic caution you learn after too many nights of listening, hands that know their way by habit. At the door stood no shadow stretched by a streetlight, no figure cloaked in the practicality of winter. Instead, the porch was empty, and the air smelled of old rope and boiled tea. The radio in the kitchen played a single clear note that hovered in the house like a held breath. I carried the postcards with me, wrapped in a towel because I had convinced myself that dryness was a kind of protection. The card with Amos's last line, "Promise me you'll keep watching," burned in my pocket like a small coin of guilt. The seawall called in a way that felt less like a pull and more like someone leaning close to ask a question. I dressed quickly and went out into the low fog. The town at that hour is not a place for artful metaphors. It is practical and damp, with cigarette ash and coffee warmth in the diner and a florist who locks the door at midnight. But the shore is where Port Huron lays out its long memories like fishing nets. The Blue Water Bridge loomed like a titan asleep. The lighthouse, older than most pictures of sanity, blinked its slow, mechanical eye. At the end of the seawall, a woman waited. She was exactly as I had expected, and not at all. Lillian, perhaps in her late 30s if she were counting the years she'd given the river. She wore the same coat the photograph had shown, heavy and salt stiff. And when she turned to me, she looked like a portrait someone had left in the rain and then attempted to rescue. Her voice, when she spoke, was small and thick, as if made of turned-over shells. "You brought him back," she said, not as gratitude, but as verdict. I set the postcards down on the concrete between us as if putting down dishes. Lillian knelt and ran her fingers over the handwriting, as careful with the curls as a person might be with a relic. "You remember," she said simply. The sound of the river was an audience, patient, indifferent, enormous. I wanted to ask her what she wanted with me, why the house and the hollow and the postcards had chosen my life to interface with their ache. Instead, I asked, "Why won't he leave you alone?" She turned to me then, and her face looked like every winter I'd ever been forced to accept. Amos left, and the town pretended it was an accident because facts have sharper edges than people can hold, she said. I held the light because someone had to. I called him because that was what kept him from being just a body on the mud, a face for the ledger. But when you remember, it becomes a story again, and stories need listeners. That might have been the most honest thing anyone in Port Huron had said to me, that memory is an obligation that loves company. I asked her what she wanted. She smiled in a way that was like a hinge releasing. "Not want," she corrected. "Ask. Will you keep watching when I cannot? Will you tell them? Will you write it down so we aren't a ledger line someone flips past?" The bargain was simple and devastating in its simplicity. If I helped Lillian move from the thin thing she had become, the blue constant attendance, she would release the house's need to call me. If I refused, the calls would become insistence. If I accepted, I would gain knowledge and wait. I thought about June, about Margot and Ruth, about Sheriff Allen, who liked tidy boxes, and I thought about the postcards in my hand and how the ink had the patience to wait a century for me to be in the right place. We walked to the lighthouse together. The keeper's door was sealed with an old iron lock that looked as if it had been there since ink dried on Amos's letter. Lillian's fingers found the grooves of the lock, and impossibly, it opened. The lamp room smelled like coal smoke and old lamps. It felt like the inside of a throat. We lit a candle from a brass holder on the sill and set the postcards up like offerings around it. Lillian read aloud, and her voice nodded the words again into meaning. She told Amos what had happened in town after he left, about the ledger and the other names, about people who waited and were left waiting. As she spoke, the room filled with a light that felt both old and new. A light not made by glass and oil, but by recognition. When she finished, she folded her hands and looked at me. "Now," she said, "you remember." The lamp flared like a small sun. I felt something slide from my chest into my palm, a thing made of cold and small beads of salt, as if someone had been kept too long in the tide and finally let go. Lillian's shoulders relaxed as if the weight of the world, or at least one corner of it, had been set aside. She smiled at me the way I imagine a woman smiles at the end of a long, necessary labor. Then she was gone, a breath that left a chill and a space. For a few nights, the house stopped speaking with the clarity it had. The clock in the kitchen ticked without stopping. The radio hummed its old songs. June slept through the nights. Eli came by and clapped me on the back and said something about finally settling into being boring. Margot borrowed the postcards and promised to keep them in the library's archive. The Hollow's lights burned their ordinary weary light. The town resumed the small negotiations that make life possible. But the sea keeps accounts. Memories are not free to wander. A week after Lillian's visit, as I was closing the trunk after locking the postcards for good, I found a single card tucked beneath the spare tire. A modern postcard exactly like the one that had appeared earlier, with a photograph of the Blue Water Bridge and, in a hurried hand, my name and a date not yet come. My fingers shook as if from a fever. I placed the card on the mantle and watched the way the light pooled on the photograph. It's easy to tell yourself you helped a ghost, that you righted something. It's harder to accept what being the keeper of a memory costs. Sometimes it's an insomnia that changes the color of your mornings. Sometimes it's being the person at the dinner table who knows the stories others prefer not to know. Sometimes it is the quiet understanding that the tide marks not only where you stand, but where someone else might step. The night I left Port Huron for a brief stretch, pulled by necessity, a job interview I couldn't refuse, I stood on the bridge and looked back at the town like a man glancing at a loved one he'd promised to remember. The streetlights flicked and the lighthouse blinked. I clutched the postcards in my coat like talismans and felt the river's draft on my face. In the morning, I would go back and sit on my porch and write down what had happened in a notebook so the ledger would have another voice. When I returned, I found a new print on the concrete by the gutter. Not a child's hand this time, but an adult palm, the lines of it worn like well-used tools. Beside it, someone had scrawled a single word in neat, stubborn capitals. Remember. I do. I remember every fog and every postcard and the way Lillian's voice sounded when she said my name. I remember Amos and the town that keeps its losses folded under other business. I remember what it means to be useful to a sorrow. The house is quieter now, but sometimes at 2:17 the radio will hum, and I will find a postcard moved from its place, or a single scrap of salt on the sill like a benediction. I tend the lamp in my own way. I tell the story to those who will listen. Some folks think that's charity, some think it's madness. Some, a few, sit and watch with me at the seawall until the fog lifts. If you come to Port Huron and the lighthouse looks like it's leaning a little toward the town, that's because it is. People sometimes smile and say places have character. They do. They also have obligations. I learned to hold one. I am not the only one who remembers. There are more cards than you'd think. They arrive on the wind, tucked between the pages of library books, slid beneath porch stones left on the seats of buses. The town has ways of asking you to carry its stories, and some of us answer. Sometimes, late at night, I hear a voice that sounds almost like mine echoing from the seawall. It says, "Keep watching." In the mirror, the lines near my eyes have salt in them now, as if the river itself has some tenure in my face. I do not always like what I have become, but I remember, and remembering is an act that keeps the living and the dead from drifting into the ledger's blankness. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Jonah Beckett. I was 32 years old on the night it happened, October 14th, 2018. And I'll never forget the way the river smelled that evening. A cold copper tang that seemed to carry voices with it. I grew up a few towns over from Port Huron, Michigan, but I hadn't lived there since college. Port Huron is the kind of place that sits where two waters meet, the St. Clair River and Lake Huron. A working waterfront with old mills, narrow streets, and a downtown that still remembers its glory days. People there keep their history like photos in an attic, a little faded, a little bent at the corners, but not for throwing away. I came back for a while to help my sister after her divorce, to work odd jobs and fix things, to be a steady pair of hands. That's how I met most of the people who matter in this story. My sister, May Larkin, rented a second-floor walk-up on Quay Street, the kind of apartment that leaned toward the river and warned you about drafts. May is practical in a restless way, an emergency room nurse who bakes too much and forgets to answer the phone. Her son, Tyler, was 7 then, a quiet kid with a habit of asking the kind of questions adults answer with a joke. Our neighbor across the hall was Ray Ellison, a retired tugboat captain with more stories than teeth. He walked like a man who'd spent his life reading the horizon. Port Huron itself has a reputation, not loud in the way big cities gossip, but a steady, low-key knowledge that some corners of town hold memories that don't want to be examined too closely. There's the old Blue Anchor Hotel, rebuilt from a storefront that once served sailors and grain haulers. There's the long boardwalk at the lighthouse, where teenagers kiss under the fog and old men toss back dark coffee. There are also neighborhoods with narrow, gaslit streets where the houses lean over one another like people sharing secrets. Stories of restless things, of sightings and footsteps and piano music heard when no piano had been touched, had floated around my whole life. I had always taken them as stories, the way you take weather, as a thing that changes and then becomes ordinary. Then there was the old lumber warehouse on Water Street. It was a hulking brick building with boarded windows and a sign swinging that had once advertised wholesale timber. The building had sat empty for years, a magnet for pigeons and kids with skateboards. To the town, it was property, a liability on a tax roll. To people like Ray, it was a place you didn't go after dark. Some said the warehouse had been a workhouse during the Depression, that men had lived and died in its shadow. Others mentioned a fire in the 1950s that took more than a roof and left something in the rafters that never quite cooled. The stories changed with each telling. That's the way those tales grow. One man's memory becomes another man's certainty. I volunteered, sometimes, at the community center by the river. That's where I met Father Morris, the kind priest who runs donation drives and cooks chili for winter nights. He had an old map of Port Huron in his office, yellowed and folded, with 2 red pins that marked properties the parish kept an eye on. He looked at the map the way people look at old photographs, with a little sadness and a steady hand. When I told him I was helping May, he clucked his tongue and said, "Keep your eyes open, Jonah. This town keeps its own watch." He said it kindly, like warning a neighbor about an icy step. Work in Port Huron was steady but small. I did carpentry, fixed porches, patched roofs, the sort of honest labor that lets you know the weight of your hands at the end of the day. Tyler and I would drink cocoa and watch old black and white detective shows while May slept between shifts. On weekends, we would walk the river and feed the ducks stale bread, watching freighters slide past like slow-moving islands. People nodded. You could meet strangers on the boardwalk and leave feeling a little safer for having been acknowledged. There were 2, the small oddities, lawn ornaments that faced the wrong way, lamplights that flickered like a heartbeat, a radio station that sometimes cut out mid-broadcast and left an open channel of hiss. You notice those things when you live someplace long enough. You start to add them up like change in a jar. You tell yourself that each thing is its own problem. A wiring issue, a bored kid with a flashlight, a weather front, until the sum of them presses against your ribs and you begin to feel a pattern, like the pieces of a puzzle whose image you can't quite make out. When May's ex-husband left, he took the furniture and the good feelings. He left the apartment and the bills. May's landlord was a soft-spoken woman named Evelyn Shaw who ran a small antique shop on Main Street. Evelyn had keys for every place in town and a memory that could place any faded postcard. She told us once, in the back room among old lamps, that a landlord in the old days had rented 3 rooms in the warehouse to workers who never quite fit anywhere else. They were called night hands, she said, men who worked when the ships came in. They drank and sang and sometimes cried. Some of them weren't built to leave. She said it almost casually, polishing a silver tray. That was the kind of thing people in Port Huron said, one eye on the past and the other on the river. I had been back in town hardly a month when odd things began happening that first autumn. At first, they were small and plausible, the sort of things you could blame on a city that had been through winters and neglect. A misplaced set of keys, a half-full cup of coffee gone cold on the table, the TV turning on to static. But on October 14th, 2018, the night I remember like a scar, those small things gathered their courage and became something that wanted attention. I had been working late at a job near the marina. May had a night shift at the hospital. Tyler was asleep on the couch. I was tired in that particular way a man gets when his body thinks it's been awake longer than it has. I remember checking the locks, hearing the river against the pilings, and thinking how ordinary the sound was, like a clock you don't notice until it stopped. That's when it started. A knock at the back door that sounded like a pair of slow, patient fists, a rhythm that didn't belong to any human schedule. At first, I told myself it was Ray, or a neighbor, or the wind. Then came the footsteps upstairs, on the floor we shared with Evelyn's rental over the shop. They weren't Tyler's light padding. They moved with purpose, pause, measure. The air inside the apartment felt like the space just before a storm. Even the air seemed to be listening. I stood at the top of the stairs and the house exhaled a long, dry sound. I tell you all this because you need the small things before the big one. The way a trap closes after a bird is in it. You have to know the people, the place, the weather, the way the town holds its breath, to understand how a single night can change everything. The main part, the part where the house stops being a house and becomes something that remembers, starts in a way that is both plain and impossible. And that, friend, is where I'll begin the story proper. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The knock at the back door stopped the world for a second, like a record that skips and then keeps going on the other side of the song. I told myself it was nothing. The rational brain is a stubborn friend. I slipped down the stairs, the floorboards creaking in a way that felt almost companionable, and opened the door. Nothing but the October air and the river light. A thin fog lay over the docks, and the street lamp cast the warehouse in a cone of pale amber. On the threshold, the doormat was folded wrong, as if someone had stood there and shifted weight from one foot to the other. I remember thinking absurdly about footprints. You can tell a lot about a man by how he stands when he waits. Inside, the apartment felt colder than it should have been. The kind of cold that isn't from outside. It's the kind that collects behind your sternum and rearranges your breathing. Tyler slept on the couch exactly where I'd left him, his small hands tucked under the blanket like a promise. May's duffel was still by the front door. She had called earlier to say her shift had been pushed to the graveyard hours. I checked the locks, checked the windows, and found the TV tuned to static. It was the kind of little domestic strangeness you shrug off until it is the first tile in a collapsed roof. I tell you now that what followed felt governed by a logic I didn't know existed. As if the town had a script and I, the fool, was learning my lines too late. The footsteps started again, upstairs but not on our floor, on the roof of the Blue Anchor across the alley where the boarded windows kept their heads turned away from the street. They were slow, measured, like a man testing each board for its willingness to groan. Then came the singing. It wasn't a melody so much as a pattern of syllables, an old work song, broken and half swallowed. The kind of song men sing to move heavy things across docks and to ward off the thought of home. Ray heard it too. He'd been on his stoop with a thermos, a man who moves like fog when he walks. He squinted up at the warehouse, his face folding into lines like a map. Been hearing it for 3 nights, he said without preamble, like a capo on a tune that won't finish. Father Morris came the next morning with coffee and a look that asked for details without demanding them. He held a newspaper clipping folded in his palm, a brittle thing about a fire in 1954 that had taken 2 men in the middle of a shift. The article used words like tragic and accident because paper does not like ghosts. But it said there had been men who lived in the timber yard, men who slept where they worked, men who'd argued about money and weather and women. It also mentioned an unmarked burial, a detail that made Father Morris's hand close like an animal's paw. Evelyn, polishing her silver trays, told me something she hadn't meant to. There was a boy, she said. Not much older than your Tyler now, if the years were kind. He used to sit by the window and whistle that song. People said he fell from the rafters. People also said he didn't fall so much as go somewhere the rest of us couldn't follow. Her voice didn't judge. Port Huron's gossip carries facts like driftwood. It floats until someone picks it up and it becomes a story. I started to notice things that I had previously excused. The smell of smoke that came and went like memory. A flicker of light in the warehouse's topmost window at times when there should have been none. The way the pigeons avoided a patch of roof, like a rumor avoided confirmation. My sleep became a thin, threaded thing. I woke at 3 a.m. with the certainty that someone was watching Tyler through the slit of blinds. Once I found a child's mitten on the stoop that wasn't Tyler's, smaller and smelled faintly of river mud and something older like coal dust. One night, the growl of summer gulls replaced by the wind's whisper, I went down to the docks. I didn't tell May. You learn fast enough that the people you love become the reason you lie to them. Ray followed at a distance, his thermos clutched like a talisman. We stood under the warehouse's eaves and listened while the town breathed. The door was ajar by a fingernail's width. Not forced, not kicked, just open, as if someone had left it that way and then forgotten. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of wet wood and something charred, not quite the dry ash of old fires, but the sharpness of something recent. My light found a trail, small, sooty prints in a line, leading away from a darkened office and down into a corridor where the moon pooled in the cracked glass of old windows. On the workbench lay a child's shoe, one half of a pair, scuffed and damp. Beside it, a scrap of paper with handwriting in a hand I recognized because we'd seen it on Tyler's drawings. A little spiral of letters that made no sense at first, until I realized someone had traced the same curve as his habit. The pencil had left a smear that could have been graphite or a fingerprint. I felt the hair pull up along my arms when the singing started again. It came from the bowels of the warehouse, from a place where the boards arched like ribs. It was closer now, a pattern of words I couldn't place but felt as if I had heard in a dream. Ray's voice was a rasp in the dark. Don't go down there, he said. He had the salt of the river in his mouth. Some things remember the shape of men. If I'd known then what I know now, if I'd listened to the small, sensible part of me that keeps its keys in its pocket, I would have left. But stories are cruel in that way. They draw you forward with the same curiosity that leads a dog to sniff a hole in a fence. I followed the prints, each one a little darker than the last, until the corridor opened to a cathedral of old timber. The rafters yawned above us. A sheet of moonlight fell like a stage lamp. And there, at the center of the room, where once men had stacked lumber and counted the hours by the creak of chains, stood a figure. Not human, not holy. It was as if an outline of a man had been cut from the night and propped up by wind. Its face, if you could call the absence of one a face, held the suggestion of eyes. The singing stopped. The air tasted of pennies and old songs. It moved then, not toward me as a thing approaches a stranger, but toward the place where the rafters had been the hottest. Something clicked in my head then, a memory like a dropped key finding the lock. The photograph at Father Morris's office, the men in suspenders with soot on their cheeks. The article about the unmarked burial. Evelyn's casual, terrible mention of boys who disappeared from the rafters. A hand, not quite a hand, brushed the side of my face, cold and damp, with the faintest scent of smoke and river water. It didn't grab. It didn't need to. It was offering something like a memory. And with that memory came a whisper in a voice that sounded like a harmonica played through a wall. "Come home," it said. I stumbled back, the beam of my flashlight trembling. Ray's thermos hit the floor with a sound like a bell. The figure moved up toward the rafters as if it had been watching for someone to welcome it. My mind did the thing it always does when the impossible appears. It makes a list of reasons the impossible could be explained away. But the list was thin and fluttered like paper in a gale. When I ran, the warehouse seemed to bend its paths the way a sleepwalker bends to keep walking. I reached the door and slammed it behind me. Outside, the river was a low drum. The town's lights were distant and stupidly ordinary. Tyler slept on the couch, breathing like someone who has no debt with history. May texted a short, joking line about overtime. I kept that night from her. I kept it from the church. I told Ray I was fine, but the sense of being watched did not leave. It had moved from the warehouse into the cracks of the house, into the hummed tune of the refrigerator, into the way Tyler sometimes paused and looked up at the ceiling as if someone were watching the television with him. I thought I had fled the place, but of course that was arrogance. Some things follow like weather. They are patient and they do not care if you understand them. I would learn, in the weeks to come, that the warehouse keeps its own hours and that the people who died there left a ledger behind that needed balancing. And that ledger, friend, had my name already inked on the next line. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. After the night in the warehouse, everything in Port Huron felt like it had been rearranged without my permission. The ordinary rhythms of days, May's shifts, Tyler's school, Ray's morning coffee on the stoop, continued like a film running on loop. But I was watching from behind the glass. I began keeping a notebook, a cheap spiral I carried in my back pocket, the way sailors used to mark tides. I wrote down the small things, dates, times, the smell that come in a pattern of days, the exact words of the song when I could catch them. It was my attempt at making order out of a town that had never forgiven itself. Tyler changed. It was slow at first. He stopped playing with his trucks and started drawing houses with odd angles, windows that seemed to look back. He began to hum the same half-remembered tune I'd heard in the warehouse, but in a child's version. Softer, as if he were trying to repeat a word he'd almost learned. Once, May found him standing at the window at dawn, face pale as the river, fingers pressed to the glass. "There's a man out there," he said, and pointed toward the old warehouse. "He says he lost his shoe." May laughed it off, the way parents will when things are inconvenient. She had shifts and late bills and 100 other small fires to put out. But later that night, she woke up calling her ex's name in a sleep-tangled panic, a sound like someone remembering a hurt. I started asking questions. I shoved through city records and minutes from old council meetings, reading the dry, bureaucratic language until it began to sound like confession. There had been a claim once against the company that owned the warehouse, a suit from families of men who'd worked odd hours. The suit had dissolved into nothing. Settlements and signed forms, and the kind of silence that costs money. Names appeared and then fell off the lists. One document, brittle and stamped with a year, mentioned a temporary burial. The words hit like ice. I took copies to Father Morris, who read them and then folded his hands the way someone folding a map does when the road is uncertain. "People will say anything to keep a roof over their heads," he said softly. But his eyes were not untroubled. He told me stories his grandfather had told him, of men who'd worked the docks during storms, who'd slept where they could and sometimes never woken. Places like that collect sorrow, he said, and sorrow given time becomes something else. Ray began to sleep with his jacket on. He said the river had started to cough at night, something like a throat clearing, and that his dreams were full of rope and cold iron. The more we shared, the more obvious it became that the warehouse had become a center of gravity for whatever was happening. We organized, clumsy and earnest. A neighborhood watch, late walks along the river, flashlights and voices meant to break whatever hush had settled. Evelyn brought over hot coffee. May, once she stopped laughing at my worry, started locking extra doors and putting salt along thresholds like an old woman with a superstition that actually functioned as a defense. But whatever had been born in that timber place didn't care for watchmen or coffee. It learned our patterns and then waited for the moments we believed we were safe. Lights would blink in the middle of the night in our living room, like the warehouse breathing across the river. Tyler woke once with muddy feet, though. He'd been on the couch all night. He told us he had walked on the planks and the man with no face had shown him the place where the boards were hot. He said to come find the other shoe, Tyler whispered, clutching his blanket as if it were proof he was not lost. Fear, in a small town, does something odd. It makes people generous in private and miserly in public. Some neighbors started to avoid our street, giving polite smiles that didn't meet the eyes. Others, like old Mrs. Colby at the grocery, brought casseroles and more stories. My cousin swore he heard children singing from that old place, she said, pressing a casserole dish into May's hands like an offering. Said it started the week he lost his sight. Bits of rumor and memory were piling up like leaves. We tried to talk to the company that owned the warehouse, a name whose office smelled of cigarettes and legal gums. The man on the phone told us the building was condemned and scheduled for demolition. Safety issue, he said. But there's a difference between a building scheduled for demolition and a thing that refuses to be torn down. The schedule came and went. Crews came one day with crewsmen and left the next with their equipment hanging like forgotten theater props. The town's bureaucracy folded like weather into excuses. Then, one particularly thin night, the line between the warehouse and our lives snapped further. Tyler didn't come down for breakfast. He didn't come down for lunch. At dusk, May found his drawings pinned to the bedroom wall like a map. Houses with missing doors and ladders leading up to black squares. At the center of the wall was a child's handprint in a smudge of something that looked like ash. He was in the warehouse. I should say that not everything in these stories bends to the rules. People are heroic in private. May called me like someone pulling at a rope. Ray opened his door and listened to the air. We drove to the warehouse in 2 cars, a ridiculous small convoy, like children trying to reenact a war movie. The warehouse door was open this time fully, yawning like the mouth of a thing that had been waiting for us. Inside, the smell of wet wood and old smoke was thick. We called his name until the sound layered itself into the rafters. There was a scuff of small footprints leading in a line, just like before, as if the place insisted on pattern. At the far end, where the light from our flashlights thinned into black, we found him standing on a pallet, staring up at the rafters. Tyler was not alone. Around him, like smoke given a shape, there were figures, not solid enough for light to catch, but solid enough for shadow to shorten around them. One of them reached for Tyler, and he didn't flinch. He looked almost content, as if he'd been invited somewhere and had finally gone. "Tyler," I said, voice useless in a cathedral of old timber. He turned slowly and smiled, but not with his lips, with his face as if a man older than him had taken over the muscles. "He says it's time," Tyler said. "He says we need to fix the counting." The voice was wrong. The word counting meant nothing and everything. I moved forward like a man pulled by strings. Ray put a hand on my shoulder that felt like knotting rope, a human anchor. "You don't go up there," he wheezed. "Not without." But something in me, some shame or stubbornness, drove me to climb. The pallet shifted under my weight. Up above the rafters, traces of old soot caught our light in the shape of letters, carved into the wood like tally marks. The air around them hummed like a tuning fork. I couldn't read them at first, and then I could. Dates, initials, names that matched the brittle papers we'd pulled from the clerk's office. The ledger of a place that had kept its accounts. A low, patient sound rose like a chorus. The figures moved closer, and in the center of their mass, the face of a man that should have been gone gaped open like absence. He lifted a hand, and the rafters answered. Somewhere in the building, a beam sighed like a man admitting a long truth. I felt something reach for me then, but not with malice. It was a demand, a counting of debts. It wanted us to remember the names, to say them out loud, to account for the lives shelved like lumber. It wanted justice in the only way it knew to balance the books. The problem with trying to bargain with something assembled from grief is that it counts differently than we do. I will tell you in the next part what I did, whether I bargained and whether the ledger accepted my voice. But know this, some things can't be fixed by paperwork, and some apologies are too late. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. I remember climbing like a man trying to outrun a debt collector, each rung of the ladder a summons. The rafters smelled of old rain and iron. The tally marks were there, a ledger carved in wood. Dates, initials, short slashes like a man keeping track of days alive. The figures below moved like smoke around a candle, patient and inevitable. The thing that had reached for me in the dark did not demand flesh. It demanded accounting. "What do you want?" I asked, the question sounding small in that huge, remembering room. The answer was not a word, but a chorus. The echo of hammers, the creak of chains, the sound of 1,000 hands counting. Father Morris later told me that some debts are not between people, but between a place and the people it held. "It wants the names," he said when I told him. "You have to say the names." So I did what any decent, stubborn man would do. I read the ledger. I read the names I'd found in the town records, the ones the paper had tried to smooth over. I spoke aloud the initials carved in the beams and the surnames that had been buried under settlements. I said the names of men who had never been given a proper stone, the boys who had fallen from rafters or never left their work shifts. I told their stories the way I would tell a prayer, clumsy, true, finally human. The air changed. When a place is heard, sometimes it hears back. A wind rose in the warehouse as if someone had opened a door to the lake. The figures gathered, not with menace, but with a kind of bitter relief. Tyler stood in the middle of them with the small, flat grin he'd made the day he started humming the song. "He says the counting is good," Tyler said, voice threaded through someone older. "He says it's time to put down the ledger." I thought then of the men in the photograph Father Morris had shown me. The faces frozen in a lighter kind of memory, soot on cheeks, the particular courage of those who worked hard without asking for much. Saying their names felt like returning a wallet someone had lost for years. It felt like light on a shelf. For a while, the warehouse was quiet, in the way a room after a sermon is quiet, full of people who have had something heavy placed down. But the ledger did not simply vanish. There is always a cost. The old things in Port Huron do not forgive. They balance. They had kept a ledger for decades and would continue to keep one, but they needed witnesses. Living people who could tell the truth if the town tried to smooth it away again. You cannot hand a ghost a check and expect a receipt. The payment they wanted was smaller, stranger, memory, attention, and the promise that their names would be spoken. "Who will remember?" one of the figures asked, and their voice was like a bell heard through wool. "I will," I said. It felt like a foolish promise, but it was all I had. I told them I would be the one to keep the list, to say the names every year, to bring flowers to unmarked graves. I told them I would not let them be papered over by settlements and schedules. In exchange, they turned their focus from Tyler and toward the rafters, as if testing the weight of an old grief. Tyler blinked then and looked at me with the small, clear face of a boy who had been given back his morning. The figures receded like breath. One of them, a boy no older than Tyler had been in the dusty photograph, held up a small shoe, its leather scuffed and damp. He set it beside Tyler's other one, and for a moment the warehouse felt absurdly like a family reunited. Tyler laughed, a small sound that made me cry. We left the warehouse before dawn, with the air feeling less heavy, like a room in which someone had finally opened a window. Ray walked beside me without his usual stoop, and Father Morris met us with bread and coffee as if this were something the town could digest in the morning. But the ledger had done what ledgers do. It had asked for an account and received one. It also took something minor and major from me in return. That winter, I found that some of my memories had thinned like a photograph left too long on a dashboard. I could remember the smell of the river and the way Tyler used to fall asleep on my chest as a baby, but the name of my first dog slipped away at odd moments. I would walk into a room and know the reason I had entered, but not the word to name it. It was as if the warehouse had taken a handful of small things, birthdays, the color of a shirt from my 18th summer, as payment. I never told May about that. How do you explain to your sister that you bartered childhood for a child's safety? The town changed in small, patient ways. The city finally scheduled crews who actually repaired the roof of the warehouse and, with a kind of municipal pity, put up a plaque that read of workers lost to time, muted, clinical language that the old things did not care for. Evelyn kept her keys and kept her shop. Ray slept better. Tyler stopped humming the song, except in the half-light when he would trace letters in his sleep and murmur names I had said to the rafters. Sometimes, in the quiet, he would sit by the window and ask if I'd remember to go to the river on the date of a name. I always said yes. People in Port Huron forgot the fine details of that winter, the way a body forgets a splinter. The event recedes, but the scar remains. Some called what happened hysteria, others a community ritual made meaningful by grief. Father Morris suggested a small memorial service one spring, and the town came, clumsy and awkward and willing. We read names aloud, not only the ones carved into wood, but names of neighbors and people who had gone missing from the bookkeeping of life. We left mementos by the river, a shoe, a button, a child's drawing. The water took them as a witness, and for the first time in a long time, the current felt like it was carrying something honest downstream. I did my part. Every year on a damp afternoon near October, I walk to the warehouse and say the names. I read them out loud into the rafters and into the river and into the town's bones. I write them in a small notebook, the same cheap spiral I carry, and tuck it into a box in my chest. The ledger answered me once and changed the shape of my life. In return, I found a shelf of patience I didn't know I had. Sometimes, late at night, when the river smells like pennies and the gulls have gone, I hear a tune. It's softer now, a thread pulled through a sweater. I don't dream of the rafters the way I once did, but every so often, if the wind is right, I walk down to the docks and watch the warehouse's windows for a light that might be a memory flickering. Tyler is older now, and he does not look at buildings the same way. He is a boy who knows the cost of being counted, and with the awkward quiet of a child who has stared a ledger in the face, he keeps his own little list of kindnesses. If you ever find yourself in Port Huron on an October evening, stop by the old warehouse and listen. Not everyone will hear anything. The town keeps its secrets like coins in a jar. But sometimes, if you stand very still, you can hear a song, a counting cadence that remembers men and names, and you will know that at least a handful of debts have been paid the right way, by being remembered. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Thomas Weller. I'm 34 years old, and what I'm about to tell you happened on the night of September 12, 2019. I don't say true story lightly. I still wake up to the shape of that night. For months afterward, I couldn't bring myself to speak about any of it, and when I finally did, people smiled politely and offered the usual. A shrug, must have been the stress, a nervous laugh. But smiles don't erase the sound of boards flexing in a house that isn't supposed to be occupied, or the way a river can carry voices. I moved to Port Huron for work, a small contractor job renovating an old Victorian near the river, and what I thought would be a straightforward gig became the kind of memory that sits in your bones. Port Huron is a place that seems to live in its history. The Blue Water Bridge arches nearby, bringing traffic and a steady hum of engines. The St. Clair River moves slow and wide, and on fog-heavy mornings, it looks like another world under the streetlights. People there say the town remembers, not in a sentimental way, but in the way old houses remember who slept in them. I had rented a room above my workshop on Washington Avenue, a block from the river, and 2 blocks from a row of empty storefronts that looked like they'd been waiting for a business to come back for 100 years. The house I was working on, a place the locals called the Brantley House, belonged to an elderly widow who'd moved in with her daughter out of state. She wanted someone trustworthy to clean out the attic and shore up the porch before winter. I took the job because money matters, and because Port Huron felt small enough I could lose myself in the work. Before that night, I'd been in similar houses, peeling wallpaper, long banister railings with carved newel posts, mantels with cigarette burns, and the ghosts of framed photos. But Brantley House had a heaviness you could feel as you crossed the threshold. The hall smelled faintly of cedar and something older, almost like the air you'd find in a closed-up attic on a hot day. The wallpaper was a faded floral, the kind that would have been cheerful in another era but stared back at you like a witness. I told myself that noticing detail was part of my job. You learn to catalog quirks and creaks, assign them to old nails, to bad wiring, to rodents. You get comfortable assigning blame to things that can be fixed. There were characters in town who I should have listened to. Mrs. Kessler, who ran the diner by the river, warned me with a tight smile, "Old houses keep secrets, Thomas. Don't be staying up there alone if you can help it." I nodded and took a coffee refill because it's a line they use sometimes, a kind of local proverb. Then there was Joel, a flooring guy whose family had been in Port Huron for generations. He told me the Brantley place had been on the edge of town long before the bridge. Folks used to bury things down by the riverbank, he said once as he handed me a replacement bolt. Not treasures, things they couldn't look at no more. It was the kind of story you file away with the others, half legend, half claim on the past. I worked during the day, pulling up floorboards, discovering old newspapers with headlines about storms and small, quiet tragedies. I found a child's wooden toy tucked in a hole between joists and thought of how people leave pieces of themselves behind. Sock buttons, a tooth, a note. The attic door had been nailed shut for decades. The craftsmen whose nails were hand-forged. The widow had wanted me to clear it out, but she also said, "Be gentle. It's been quiet up there." She spoke as if quiet were a thing that could be disturbed and didn't want me to do that. At first, the nights were ordinary. I slept in the small room I rented overhead of the workshop, windows open to the river breeze. The town has its rhythms. Tugboats early, fishermen's chatter along the docks, and the distant clang of the drawbridge. I was alone more than not. My ex-wife lived in another state, and work tensions had left me choosing quiet over company. Alone, you notice the house more. The soft pop of settling timber at 3 a.m. becomes a narrative. The house is tired, it whispers. I made friends slowly. Naomi at the library brought me coffee and a stack of old Port Huron photographs when she heard I was cataloging the Brantley house. She liked to tell the histories of houses as though they were people with long lives and secret habits. This town held the water, then the factory people came, and with them came stories that don't go away, she'd say, tapping the edges of a photo like pages of an old book. I liked that she treated buildings as worthy of attention. People in Port Huron treated the past with a respect that I'd never encountered before. They treated it like a living thing and, for the most part, kept up a polite distance. The work had given me a schedule and then, slowly, intrusion. That first week, I found scratch marks on the underside of a downstairs window. Shallow, deliberate, like someone had pressed a fingernail into damp plaster over and over. I told myself kids did mischief. Maybe neighborhood boys had snuck in when the house was empty. The more I looked, the less the explanation satisfied me. When you are alone with boards and plaster, you learn how to falsify fear. You invent explanations to keep your pulse steady because fear, true, unadorned, makes your hands shake and your tools slip. By the time September dwindled into late nights, my imagination had become both companion and saboteur. There were small signs, too. A whisper of movement beside the fireplace when no draft could reach it, a single footprint in sawdust that wasn't mine, a single child's laugh in the street that seemed to come from nowhere. I would correct myself in the mirror. It's the wind. It's the neighbor's radio. It's your mind. And I meant it. I clung to those rational sentences like a flimsy lifeline. But then there were things that logic didn't help. An old photograph slid from a frame and lay face down on the floorboards, even though the nails were tight. The attic door, which I'd sealed, would creak open in half an hour after I left the house. You should understand by now that none of this escalated in a cinematic rush. It spread like mold, slow, unnoticed at first, then visible in corners. My friends noticed my dark circles. Naomi asked once, "Are you sleeping?" I lied. "Yeah, work's just taking it out of me." Joel handed me an extra flashlight and said, "Take it easy up there, man." I appreciated the concern and dismissed it. People in small towns have ways of watching out for one another, and that can be a blessing or a burden, depending on how you need them. The night it started in earnest, the main thing that won't let me sleep sometimes, didn't arrive with thunder or a pack of cinematic jolts. It began with a sound that, at first, I thought was mundane. The soft tapping of something against the attic floor. I told myself it was a bird trapped in the eaves, or maybe a branch rubbing against a window. I got up to check, moving through the house with the kind of heavy, deliberate footsteps of someone who'd worked here all day and had nothing left to give. When I reached the attic door and pushed it open, the air that breathed out smelled of river mud and old paper. The light from my flashlight fell across boxes and trunks, and for the first time since I'd started on the house, I felt watched, as if eyes had just folded closed. The tapping stopped. That was when the main story began. The tapping's silence was not comfort. It was a held note, like breath before the scream. I lifted a trunk lid and found, tucked beneath yellowed linens, a child's shoe and a folded scrap of paper. The handwriting was a child's, maybe 9 or 10, and the words weren't a name or a date, but a short sentence. I can't find my way back. The attic seemed to tilt, and the river outside struck the night like a slow drum. I should have left then. I did not. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The attic scrap, I can't find my way back, stayed in my pocket like a splinter. I lay awake that night listening to the house settle and the river talk in its slow, constant voice. The words echoed in my head. I can't find my way back. It was children's handwriting, crooked and earnest, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I felt responsible for answering it. The next morning, I took the scrap to Naomi. She frowned at it, turning the paper over gently as if she were handling something fragile and sacred. That could be from any time, she said. But there's a sorrow in the way it's written, not a prank. Naomi had the librarian's habit of making history feel immediate. She treated handwriting like an artifact with a pulse. The Brantleys have been in that house forever, she told me. But there were gaps. People come and go. Sometimes they leave without finishing a thing. Evelyn Brantley finally returned my call. She was small-boned and spoke with a careful distance, as if she'd learned to protect the edges of her life. She lived in Toledo now and had only come back to organize the sale. She asked me not to disturb any family items, but when I told her about the scrap, she softened. My brother, Samuel, used to play up there, she said, and for a moment the phone line carried the ghost of a laugh. He had a way of hiding notes in the house. He liked riddles. There was a pause. Samuel drowned when he was 12. She didn't say when. She didn't need to. I started to think about the way water keeps secrets. The St. Clair River could swallow things whole. People say rivers remember every footstep that crosses them. Maybe they keep the shape of a body. Samuel, a boy's shoe under the trunk. The more Evelyn spoke in those halting sentences, the more the house felt like an unfinished conversation. Work gave me the only real breaks. Daylight is a kind of armor. With a ladder in my hand and a job to finish, fear had rules and deadlines. I pulled baseboards and found under a skirting board another scrap, this one a faded penny red ribbon tied into a knot. I remember sitting on the floor with it in my palm, thinking about all the small, bright things children carry. The town felt smaller after that, like a hand had been laid over it and everything whispered beneath. More than once, townsfolk came by to tell the kind of small, unhelpful stories that thread through places with long memories. Old Mr. Whitcomb from the hardware store swore he'd seen a light in the attic years ago when the Brantleys had gone to a fair. You find toys on your porch sometimes in this town, he said. People leave tokens. It don't mean much until it means everything. Joel told me to keep my toolbox locked and to bring a friend if I went into the house at night. The worry in his voice was real. He had that practical worry of someone used to fixing things that can be fixed. That line between fixable and not fixed is the cruel part. You can replace a roof, you can pad a foundation, but you can't nail down a feeling. And the house kept finding ways to remind me of what couldn't be nailed. I started hearing a pattern. A sound like someone walking on the porch at odd hours, always 3 steps and a pause. I chalked it up to a raccoon for 2 nights. The 3rd night, I stepped onto the porch, and the boards were cold. There were wet footprints, small and bare, leading toward the river and vanishing at the lip of the yard, as if whoever walked them had stepped into the night and simply ceased. I told myself 100 rational things. Maybe it was the neighbor's grandson. Maybe the tide had pulled someone along the bank and they'd left prints in the soft mud, and the breeze had brought them to my porch. But when I followed the trail once, the path curved as if someone had wandered confused, and there, half buried in mud, was a child's wooden toy I recognized from the attic trunk, a small, chipped wooden horse with one wheel missing. I went to the river that night. The moon was a thin coin, and the bridge lights bled into the water. I stood on the bank and felt the cold from the river climb my ankles. There's a physical knowledge that comes when you stand where things happened, an ache, a memory not your own, like knuckles of bone pressing under your skin. I heard whispering in the reeds. It wasn't language at first, just patterns. But underneath it, I thought I could hear a name, Sam, and then nothing. The name slid away like a fish. That visit changed my sleep. The house started answering me when I wasn't ready to ask. I would wake to the sound of someone humming a partial tune with no beginning and no end. It reminded me of lullabies clipped short. Once I found my tools laid out on the kitchen counter, sharpened and clean, as if someone had anticipated the work I'd do that day. Another time, a photograph of Samuel, small, round-faced, hair in a crooked part, appeared on my workbench, though I'd never seen it before. It was old, the edges curled, and someone had written on the back in small, crowded handwriting, Samuel, 12 summers. The ink had faded almost to breath. Evelyn came back to town for a weekend. She moved through the Brantley house like someone threading a needle, careful, precise, hands quiet. We sat in the parlor and talked about Samuel. She told me a version of what had happened, then another, then a third. People rearranged tragedies to make them smaller. She said he wandered down to the river one July afternoon to skip stones and didn't come back. There were searches and prayers and a police report. And then time did what it does. It settles dust and files away names. My mother could not look at that home after, she said. She packed things in boxes and put them away like they were dangerous. It's like someone kept trying to finish something, I said. Evelyn looked at me, and for a moment she wasn't Evelyn, the careful woman who had moved to Toledo. She was a sister who had been keeping a space open for years. My mother heard him sometimes, she said quietly. On the porch, they said, but she left and the house closed itself. She thought the sound would go away if she wasn't there to hear it. But you found the attic. You found his things. We lit candles in the house that night. It was a small, foolish rebellion against the clean white light of law and explanation. Candlelight makes shadows that move like living things, and that suited the house. At first, the candles made the room comfortable in an old-fashioned way, the way we like to imagine people felt around a hearth in simpler times. But before midnight, the flames bent toward the window as if listening. A breeze that couldn't have existed in a sealed parlor brushed over the candles without putting them out, and a single ragged breath seemed to pass through the room. The candles flickered. I felt, somewhere at the edge of hearing, the same three-step pause as on the porch. The small things continued, piling up until they were a mountain. Objects moved, toys appeared in unlikely places, and the handwriting scraps found their way into corners where no drafts could reach. Whoever Samuel had been, the house remembered him in the way an old friend remembers a joke. It was affectionate and also terrible because remembrance, unchecked, becomes a demand. On the last night before Evelyn returned to Toledo, I stood at the window looking at the river, the Brantley house breathing behind me. The wind moved through the eaves like a second voice. I thought of the scrap in my pocket and the way it had changed my days. I thought of the boy who couldn't find his way back. I thought of how often the living let the dead play the part of unfinished business because it's kinder than knowing the truth. I didn't yet understand what the truth wanted from us. I only knew it was no longer content to be a story in a trunk. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. After Evelyn left for Toledo, the house seemed to change its aim. Before, it was meant to be noticed in small ways. A toy left on the bench, a whisper at the window. Now it wanted an audience. The scratches on the window grew deeper as if someone practiced the same motion until the glass knew the shape of a hand. The hush that had once been shy became solicitous, pressing at the edges of my days. I started keeping a notebook. There's a practical comfort to writing down a thing you can't explain. It makes the unexplainable look like a list of errands. I wrote times, sounds, the weather, where a toy had been found, what I'd dreamed. My page filled with the ordinary minutiae of a life and the thread through it. Samuel's name appearing in odd places, a boy's laugh folding into the rustle of the river rush. Naomi came by more frequently, ostensibly to sort through old photographs and records, but also because she admitted the house made her uneasy, and she wanted to be near someone who understood it. There's bravery in librarians. Naomi's was quiet, stubborn, the kind that presses until a story gives up its secret. We dug deeper into the town records. In Port Huron, memory and paper sometimes match, sometimes do not. The missing boy reports were thin, an item in a summer police blotter, a single paragraph in a Sunday paper listing search volunteers, and the hope that someone would call with news. No body was found, not then. In a box of old clippings Naomi brought over, there was a letter, typed, bureaucratic, noting that the search had been suspended but that the case remained open. There was also a small, grainy photograph of a group of boys on a riverbank. One of them had a crooked part in his hair and a smile that caught the light. The back read in a tiny hand, Sam with the skipping stones. 12 summers. I wanted to believe the past could be neatly filed away and solved with enough paper. But the house resisted tidy conclusions. One night, while I tried to sleep, I heard the attic door open and the soft scraping of a child's shoe on the floor above me. I kept still and breathed like someone practicing a trick. The steps crossed the ceiling and stopped directly above my head. There was a pause. 3 counts, then a sound like someone pressing a palm to the plaster and breathing. Things you can't explain get louder when you refuse to look. I climbed the attic ladder with my flashlight and a hammer because men who work with their hands tend to carry their business tools into every argument. The attic was cold. My flashlight skittered across trunks and dust motes, and then it landed on a small silhouette near the rafters, something no taller than a child. For a terrible, bright moment, I thought it was a toy propped on a box. Then it moved. It wasn't a full-bodied apparition. It was the impression of one, a shifting, translucent outline that hovered above the trunk where I'd found the first shoe. The outline had the suggestion of hair and the tilt of a head. I heard, like a record skipping, the phrase from the scrap, "I can't find my way back." I spoke to it without meaning to. "Sam?" My voice sounded ridiculous in that vast, cold space, like a rope thrown into fog. The shape answered with a sound that could have been a laugh or a sob. The hairs along my arms rose. I can't say whether I did something real that night or whether the shape wanted me to believe it had been helped. I moved among the boxes, pulling out skirts, old coats, brittle ribbons, anything that might have carried a child's scent. I laid them on the floor like offerings. The figure watched. At one point something, a small wooden horse, rolled off a trunk and stopped at my boot. My hand, which had been shaking, closed around it. The attic felt sudden and alive with expectation, as if the house had been waiting for me to acknowledge it. After that night, I stopped sleeping more than about 2 hours at a stretch. The river sounded nearer. People started to notice the way I moved through town, eyes rimmed with shadows like someone who'd been waiting in cold water. Joel offered to drive me out to the old quarry one dawn. He said that sometimes being away from a place makes it quiet. We drove along the river and Joel talked about things that seemed unimportant. The weight of a toolbox, the certainty of nails. He was practical in a way that steadied me. But when I mentioned Samuel, his face folded. "There's been talk," he said finally. "Folks say sometimes the river keeps more than you think. Folks talk about a place downriver where currents whirl and pull like jaws." Talk, I learned, is an odd currency in small towns. It circulates and changes shape. Some of it is rumor, some of it is confession. By mid-October, the stories grew teeth. An old fisherman swore he'd seen a child's shoe tangled in reeds and that when he reached with a pole to free it, the water had swirled and then was perfectly still. An elderly woman at Naomi's church claimed that her brother had heard a child's humming under the floorboards of his home once a year on certain nights. No one wanted to say possession or ghost because those words carry shame, or perhaps because nameable things are easier to dismiss and they didn't want to dismiss whatever this was. The push to understand moved me toward the riverbank where Samuel had last been seen. I waded into the shallows one raw morning, the cold biting my calves. There are places where the riverbed is flinty and flat, perfect for skipping stones, and others where the water deepens suddenly. I found a spot where the bank jutted in and the current eddied. The ground there was full of the flattened marks of shoes and old footprints, a palimpsest of small lives that had once played there. I dug with my bare hands because spades felt too formal. After a few minutes, my fingers hit something that was not stone. I unearthed a rusted tin box. Inside were things that made my throat close: a ribbon, a penny, a child's whistle, and a slip of paper folded until it was soft as tissue. On it, in a hand that trembled with years, was written, "I am scared of the dark river. Help." When I took the box to Naomi, her face went all the colors of old photographs. "We should give this to the police," she said, and there was an edge to her voice that there hadn't been before. We did. The officer who took the box had a face like someone who'd seen his share of human sadness and a care that suggested he wanted to be useful. He said they would reopen the report and run the box for prints and possibly DNA, though he cautioned that after so many years, the evidence might be compromised. Still, the formalities of police work felt like a rope thrown into dark water. Maybe it would bring something up. It did bring something up, though not in the neat, judicial way I'd hoped. After the officer left, the house reacted as if insulted by the intrusion of rational things. That night, the humming in the walls grew louder until it became a hymn of sorts, a looped melody that tugged at the hems of sleep. I dreamed of walking down a path through reeds and finding a small hand reaching for mine. I woke with fingers numb from clenching nothing. And then, the most physical thing yet, I was pulled, not by a hand I could see, but by a pressure that pressed into the core of me and tugged my feet toward the river. I was in the kitchen, coffee gone cold at my elbow, when the floor seemed to angle and my body leaned. It was as if the house had decided I should follow a child into the dark. I stumbled 3 steps and nearly fell. My fingers caught the back of a chair, and the pressure eased like the tide pulling away. I thought, in that thin, stunned space, of all the ways a place can claim you. It was not malevolent in a simplistic way. There was a pleading in it, a tug that felt like sorrow more than malice. I called Joel and he came immediately. He found me sitting by the sink, staring at the river with the simple, stunned look of a man who had been given something he didn't want. "You can't stay here alone," he said. And he was right. After that, I started sleeping in his camper on a lot behind his shop, but moving my body didn't move the house. When I returned during the day to collect tools or check on work, the house would greet me with a child's laugh and a message in dust on the parlor floor: "Come with me." The note was simple and crystalline. It wasn't written by ink, but by something that shifted the grime into letters. I read it, and my stomach turned. I understood then that whatever this was wasn't content with being remembered. It wanted completion. It wanted company in the place where it had been lost. I didn't yet know what completion meant. I only knew the river wanted something, and Samuel, whoever his life had been, had left pieces of himself like breadcrumbs down into the water. The town had its stories, the police had their box, and Naomi had her steady hands. But beneath all that, the house hummed. And every time I passed its threshold, I felt the hollow at its center, asking me the same urgent, childish question: will you help me find my way back? Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. I kept putting off the thing that kept gnawing at me. You can't half-answer a child's plea. I'd been circling the house like a man around a wound, sometimes close enough to feel heat, sometimes stepping back because the sight made my fingers tremble. Nights in Joel's camper did nothing to cut the tether. The house would breathe in, and I would twitch like something on a line. Finally, the ache of inaction got louder than the ache of fear. We went at dawn. Naomi and Joel came with me. Naomi with her stack of old clippings and a calm that felt like a tool. Joel with the practical bluntness of a man who knows how to pry things open. I called the officer who had taken the tin box, and he arrived with a polite, tired gravity. He wasn't the sort to make promises he couldn't keep, but when he heard about the footprints and the toys and the way the house had pushed at me, his jaw hardened like a man deciding to go where bureaucracy doesn't always bother to look. We started back at the riverbank where I'd found the tin. The town had a way of shrinking around the river at that hour, a gray, patient hush. Naomi crouched near the water and ran a careful hand through the mud. Currents move, she said, but they don't always scatter everything perfectly. Sometimes they tuck things into hollows, and the river keeps them. Sometimes it takes them, and sometimes it waits. There was no ritual to her words, just the steadiness of someone used to opening histories. We called in a small dive team the officer recommended. The men who arrived wore faces like men who'd seen cold water take more than their fair share of secrets. They came with ropes, lights, and the pragmatic language of professionals. We find, we mark, we recover if we can. The idea of recovery felt like a small, clean thing to do. If the house wanted completion, then this was a way to hand it over. The divers waded into the current where the river bent and the water hummed oddly, wary of an undercurrent that slipped things away in whispers. They worked methodically, their lights carving windows in the dark water. For an hour, nothing came up but silt and the occasional scrap of soggy paper. Then one diver surfaced with something clutched in mud, a small, waterlogged shoe. It was tiny enough to fit in a palm, and the leather had long since softened to memory, but the stitching was the kind that a child would have worn, the same shape as the shoe I'd found in the attic. My throat closed so tight I had to look away. It didn't stop there. In a shallow eddy not far off, a sunken place the current loved to hide things in, the divers found a rusted frame and, beneath an old snag of reeds, bone. The thing about recovery is that it's both victory and wound. There is relief in naming what was lost, and grief for the truth of it. They lifted the remains with care, placing them in a wrapped cloth like a small, slow offering. The officer, who had been frank about the limits of forensics, looked older somehow when he handed the cloth to Evelyn Brantley a day later. Evelyn came back for the recovery. She stood on the bank with the tide at her boots and watched like someone watching a memory be plucked from the mud. She didn't say much. When I asked whether she wanted the burial in Port Huron, she nodded, the motion small and steady and full of things I couldn't measure. Naomi arranged for a modest ceremony. The town sent a few people, Mr. Whitcomb, a pair from the library, an elderly woman who said she'd known the Brantley family before the bridge went up. We buried the child by the river in the late gray light, a small marker, a carved pebble for a name. Samuel. If the paper and the photograph and the shoe were honest, that was the name that belonged to that small life. What happened afterward was a kind of slow, stubborn mercy. The house softened. The tapping that had once been precise and insistent became sporadic and then rare. Toys still appeared from time to time in odd corners of the parlor, but they were fewer, and when they turned up, they didn't feel like accusations. They felt like breadcrumbs from a child saying, "I remember." The attic stopped unlocking itself at night. The humming dwindled into the rustle of wind. Evelyn sold the house quietly to a couple who wanted to restore it, and when I went by months later, there were painter's tarps over the porch and the sign of new beginnings on the lawn. That doesn't mean the town forgot. People in Port Huron spoke about the river differently after that summer. Fishermen moderated their jokes, and Naomi cataloged the clippings with an extra tenderness. I went back to work, finally finishing the renovations I had started, but something in me had altered. There are markets for closure on the internet, neat bundles you buy and dispatch with a click. Real closure is uglier and quieter. It doesn't come with applause. It comes with the slow work of naming, of uncovering small artifacts, of listening when old houses press for attention. Sometimes, on autumn evenings, when the bridge lights sputter and the river is a hard, polished thing, I walk along the bank and feel the current slide around my ankles. I think about small lives and how often they're rearranged by forces that look like accident. I think about the way a town remembers and the obligations we take on when we choose to stay. If anything changed me more than the recovery, it was the knowledge that being passive in the face of a child's plea is a kind of harm in itself. The house taught me that. Do I believe the house was haunted in the way movies show? Not exactly. What I saw and heard and felt were real. What they meant is another thing. The house was a repository of memory that pressed until the town answered. When we listened, and when we dug into the stubborn mud of the river and took the bones back to the light, the house quieted. That, to me, is the important part. When a community responds, even with small actions, the past stops needing to scream. I kept one thing from that time. the wooden horse with the missing wheel that had rolled to my boot in the attic. I sanded it down and kept it on my workbench. It sits there now, around the edge of my day, a little proof that children were here, this whole in a way the record might never be. Sometimes, when the light from my shop window spills onto the pavement and the river hums in the distance, I imagine a small hand patting that horse. It comforts me. It saddens me. It binds me. I moved out of Port Huron a year later, not because I couldn't stay, but because it seemed right to carry the story forward rather than let it rot into the floorboards of a single house. I tell this now because some nights I still wake to a pause in my chest and think of a scrap of paper with a child's handwriting on it. We all have things we keep folded inside us. Mine is the sound of a river and a child's half sentence that reached me and made me do something. If you ever find yourself in a small town with an old house and a river, remember that asking what happened is sometimes the bravest act you can do. Memory is heavy. It can sink you if you let it. But it can also lift the dead into names again. We did that for Samuel. The house was quieter afterward, as if the thing that had been pressing at its ribs had been eased. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Joel Whitman. I was 34 years old on October 12th, 2019. The night everything I trusted about Port Huron, Michigan changed. I moved to Port Huron 2 years before that, drawn by a job at a marine supply company and the promise of water that never quite slept. The town sits where the St. Clair River opens into Lake Huron, and you can feel the water in the bones of its streets, in the salt, sweet air, the steady fog that creeps off the bridges early in the morning, and in the iron scent left on fingers after a night by the docks. I'd grown up in a different kind of quiet, the kind where cornfields split the horizon. But Port Huron taught me a different hush, a kind of patient listening that made every small sound seem important. People in town have nicknames for things: the Blue Water Bridge, the lighthouse at Fort Gratiot, the old rail yard by Whitaker Street. I learned those nicknames fast. I also learned the smaller lore. The watermen who swore a boat that runs too close to shore will hear a lullaby underwater. The rumor that the old asylum at the edge of town once used the river to wash away evidence. The story about a house on Elmwood Avenue where the porch light never goes out. Some of it was tourist market myth, the kind of spooky you tell around bonfires to make friends laugh. Some of it wound into the town's roots and came out of people's mouths with a hush, as if speaking too loud might wake something sleeping. I worked the late shift at the supply place, and most nights I walked home along the river. The walk was 2 miles through a neighborhood with clapboard houses and small, careful gardens. I made friends: Pete, the bartender at a place called the Union Tap; Lila, a librarian with a fondness for old maps; Marcus, a retired tugboat captain who smelled like diesel and peppermint. Marcus loved to tell me about the lighthouse keepers, how they would keep watch against both storms and loneliness, and how loneliness had teeth of its own. There was a house I always noticed when I passed on Elmwood. It stooped low to the street, shingles slack with age, a porch that sagged like an old mouth. The curtains were always drawn, the mailbox was crooked. A weather-stained sign once hung on the corner post: Whitaker Estate, 1883. People in town said it belonged to a family that left town in a hurry, though no one could quite say why. The house had that look that made you cross the street to get away from it, not because it was brashly frightening, but because it suggested a patient, stored history, like dried things in jars. I never intended to get tangled with it. I only intended to walk by. My friend Lila liked those kinds of houses. She mapped them, cataloged them, and once dragged me through a storm to see the stained glass window in an Episcopal church downtown. Places keep histories the way we keep scars, she said, and she had the confident, slightly tired smile of someone who collected other people's pasts like postcards. It was Lila who told me the Whitaker house had a name in older records, the Grayson House, and that an old newspaper clipping claimed a young man disappeared from the docks near Port Huron in 1927. The clipping was a single paragraph, yellowed and skeptical, but it lingered in her voice when she spoke about it like an echo that refused to die. I liked details. I liked how people left marks: a chipped step, a carved initial in a banister. Those marks made the town feel less anonymous. In the weeks before October, I began to notice a pattern of small things going missing near the Whitaker place. A child's marigold, a loose screw from a gate, a pair of gloves left on a stoop. People joked about raccoons. Pete joked more darkly, maybe she collects things to remember. She being the house, as if houses in Port Huron could be feminine and deliberate. The weather that October had the brittle, sharp edge of an early lake freeze. Nights were cold enough that breath fogged, and a low cloud sat on the river like a held breath. There were fishermen still out on the water in vestiges of summer, and there were nights when you could hear the bridge humming like some living thing. I had a small apartment above a florist's shop, a place full of dried stems and the lingering hint of lavender. It felt safe enough. But safety in Port Huron was often polite and temporary. The sort of thing you wore for a season until some small change made you uncomfortably aware of how long you had been pretending. 2 weeks before the incident, Marcus invited me to ride along with him on a daytime tow. He told stories about the shadow light people used to see near the mouth of the river on foggy mornings. Not the lighthouse beam, but something else. A faint, rhythmical blink that no amount of theories could explain away. He tapped ash into the palm of his hand and said he'd seen it when he was a young man. "It plays with you," he said, "like a child with a toy." I listened because men who have spent their lives on rivers often speak as if things are in conversation. Tides, gulls, lights. Marcus's tales were practical and uncanny in the same breath, and they weighted the air between us. On the night of October 12th, I had been late to dinner with Lila because of overtime. We drank coffee and talked about the old clipping she'd found in the archives, a young man and a missing ring, and the way the town's memory seemed to circle back on itself. She was the sort of person who believed in the stubbornness of stories. They resurface when the ground's soft enough, she said, tapping the table as if stories were seeds waiting for rain. I laughed then, a small, brittle thing, and told her I'd walk home. It was only 2 miles, I said. The river would keep watch. The main story started when I decided, on that cold October night, to cut across the park by the river instead of taking the usual lit streets. The lamp posts on the park path had been under repair, someone had said, and the boardwalk by Fort Gratiot had shuddered in a wind the week before. I thought of the Whitaker house and the way its porch light had once looked like a single stubborn eye. I thought of the clipping Lila had shown me and of Marcus's shadow light. I did not think at that moment of how small decisions can set a clock in motion. I stepped onto the path and felt the night lean in. Something in the air felt like the moment before a bell rings, expectant, thin, electric. The river whispered, close and low, as if telling me not yet. And then the first sound I could not place. Not wind, not water, but a soft scraping, like someone moving a chair across a wooden floor inside a house with closed windows. It was coming from the direction of Elmwood Avenue from the Whitaker place. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. I followed the sound because that's what I always did when the town started whispering at me. I listened. The path was darker than I'd expected. The moon was half hidden behind a cloud and the park lamps were more rumor than light. My breath came out in little puffs that vanished before I could name them. The scraping kept time, patient and slow, like someone pacing a room and counting their breath. As I drew closer to Elmwood, the air changed. The river's smell, fish, iron, cold, was cut with the faint, sweet tang of something rot and old, like perfume left in a pocket for decades. The Whitaker house looked worse in the dark. The porch sagged more than I remembered. The curtains were a heavier sort of darkness now, and the crooked mailbox had that same habit of making the rest of the street seem jaunty and alive, as if the house were an island of neglect. The scraping stopped when I stepped into its sightline. For a second I thought I imagined the silence. Then a single low note began, musical and wrong at once, as if a music box had been wound by someone who'd forgotten the tune. It threaded itself through the air, and beneath it I heard, or thought I heard, a second sound, a softer one, like someone humming along under their breath. It tugged at a place in my chest that I hadn't known existed, a place that marks you for attention. I circled the house because walking straight up to its porch felt like an invitation I wasn't entitled to give. The backyard was a clutter of shadows, and a broken swing moved without wind. From there, I could see the river cutting a black slice beyond the row of trees, the bridge set like a sleeping animal across its span. In the house's second-story window, a pale square blinked once, twice. Not a lamp, but a face-shaped light. My skin tightened. I remembered Lila's clipping then. A young man went missing from the docks in 1927, last seen wearing a copper ring engraved with a tiny anchor. The clip's ink had bled into the cheap paper like a bruise. Marcus's shadow light, the lullaby fishermen swore they heard, the Whitaker porch light that never went out, they tangled in my head until I couldn't tell which was rumor and which was history. I felt foolish and brave at the same time, the classic amateur's twin pulses that get you into bad decisions. A scent, wet wood, and something sweeter led me to the side door. The latch gave with a scraped sigh. Inside, the air was warmer than outside, and the music box tune was clearer, a child's melody that had lost its center. Dust lay like powdered memory over the staircase, and on the mantel I saw family photos gone gray at the edges. Faces looked away from me as if embarrassed by what the house had kept. There were small signs of life, or of what pretended to be life. A teacup on a saucer, ringed with dust, but still sitting as if someone might come back to it. A single child's shoe in the hallway. On the stair tread, a round, flattened impression like a coin had been pressed there and left the shape of its passing. It was small and ridiculous, and then fiercely important, like a clue in a puzzle where every piece means someone else's ruin. I found the music box in a parlor room that smelled of cedar and old paper. It sat on a low table, its lid half open, and the tiny ballerina inside spun and stopped when the dust motes clogged the mechanism. Around it, someone had scattered shells, small, river-smooth things, in a careful line toward the window. The line ended at a photograph face down on the sill. When I turned it, I felt the room tilt. It was an old portrait of a young man in a sailor's jacket, hair parted exactly like my father's used to be. Someone had scratched a small anchor into the bottom corner of the frame with a pocket knife. Beneath the glass in the corner, there was something dark and round caught in the dust. I thumbed it loose and held it up. A ring, thin and greened with age, the faint shape of an anchor still readable in the metal. It was colder than it should have been. My hands remembered the clipping, the missing man, the ring. The coincidence made the hair on my arms lift. The ring felt heavy with saying. I slid it into my pocket, thinking I'd return it to Lila, or to the archive, or to someone who kept careful inventories of towns and their absences. I didn't expect the way the house seemed to exhale behind me, a long, wet breath that smelled of river and old perfume. On the walk home, I kept thinking of how small things add up. A ring, a music box, a missing man, the town's hushed stories. My phone, when I checked it later, had a single message from Pete. You okay? Saw you by Whitaker. Lights gone nuts. I typed back a joke about ghost tours and then sat with the ring in the drawer by my bed, feeling absurdly guilty for treating a thing like a curiosity. That night I dreamed of the river in a way that felt like premonition. Not water moving, but water waiting. In the dream, I was standing ankle deep, and there was a light on the surface that blinked gently, like a clock counting the beat of something patient. A voice under the water sang a lullaby in a language I didn't know and somehow understood. I woke up with the tune in my mouth and the taste of iron at the back of my teeth. Over the next days, small strangeness threaded through my life. Tools misplaced themselves in the supply shop, only to be found in the back of old boxes. Neighbors mentioned odd knocks in the night. A cat I knew to be aloof began to follow me as if it recognized an aura I'd never noticed. Peter offered to fix my porch light. Marcus grunted and said he'd stop watching the river for me if I told him everything I thought I'd seen. Lila began to show up at odd hours with more clippings. Then, on a damp morning, a letter came addressed to me in a handwriting I didn't recognize. It was one sheet, thick paper, no return address. Inside were a few sentences. You took what belongs to the river. Return it before it remembers where it was hidden. No name. The ink had bled slightly, as if written near rain. My stomach went cold enough to make a ringing in my ears. I told myself it was a joke. I told myself that towns invented drama to pass the hours, that someone with too much time and a taste for mischief had found my drawer and my curiosity. But my sleep frayed. The river began to show up in my thoughts at odd hours, like a clock that strikes when you least expect it. I found myself listening for the music box tune in quiet places, in the hum of the refrigerator, in the clink of cups, and always, faint beneath, the sound was there. One night, I woke to find the ring gone from the drawer. A coldness hovered at the foot of my bed like breath. In the corner of the room, the music box melody sputtered once and then stopped. The window was open even though I had closed it. Outside, somewhere along the river, a light blinked with the slow, patient rhythm of someone who had been waiting a very long time. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The ring was gone the night the river started answering me. I woke with the taste of iron and a melody stuck like a splinter under my tongue. Outside my window, the river hummed a slow, patient line, the same blink Marcus had described, and somewhere very close, something knocked once against a hull as if to mark time. My hands went to the drawer out of habit before my brain caught up with fear. The space where the ring had been was empty and cold, as if someone had taken the heat out of the wood when they left. I told myself to call Lila. I told myself to call Marcus. Instead, I walked. The night swallowed my apartment behind me. The lamp by the florist flicked and died as I passed. The air tasted like copper and old leaves. The street toward Elmwood felt longer than it should have. The houses leaned in to listen. I kept expecting the music box tune to spool out from a gutter or a grate, but it came from everywhere and nowhere. A thin, domestic song made strange by distance. Lila met me at the archive before dawn, a stack of newspapers clutched like weapons. She had that look she gets when a discovery is both beautiful and perilous, brows knit, hands shaking slightly. They called him Elias Crow, she said without preamble, as if the name might be a thing we could set on a table and look at. Missing from the docks, 1927. They wrote that he kept a copper ring with an anchor. His family tried to sue the river once, said it stole him. She tapped a thin column with a finger that left an ink-smeared crescent. There's mention of Whitaker taking in strangers, too. It's like the house and the river were in trade. Hearing the name made the hair at the base of my skull stand up. Elias Crow. The sailor in the photograph, the anchor scratched on the frame, the ring I'd seen in the Whitaker parlor. It made the coincidence feel less accidental and more like a calculation I'd somehow wandered into. Lila folded the clipping carefully and slid it across the table. "Whatever you've taken," she said quietly, "it's not just a trinket." I should have left it at that. I should have let the ring be the ring and not a promise. But human curiosity is a poor sentinel at midnight, and I am, stubbornly, a man who keeps following sounds until he understands them or until they swallow him. That evening, I carried a thermos of coffee and a terrible resolve. Marcus met me at the river in his old coat, the collar turned up against the wind. "You look like the sort who's been pulling at a seam," he said, as if seams and rivers were one and the same thing. He squinted at me. "You're not going near it alone, Joel. Not tonight." "Why?" I asked, the words stupid and desperate. Marcus spat to the side. "Because this town remembers how to collect debts. Because you brought back something that wasn't yours to bring. Because when the river gets a taste of a thing, it wants it special." He said it as if that were factual and not superstition. And the conviction in his voice made me remember all the things about rivers I had only ever half believed. That they keep their own time. That they erode secrets slowly until they pop free, like fish bones. We walked to the Whitaker house together. The porch light was a stubborn coin in a jar of darkness, the same soft eye that had watched me before. The side door protested less than I expected when Marcus pushed it. Inside, the parlor smelled of damp cloth and something sweeter and older, like the hollowed-out core of an orchard. The music box sat where I'd left it, ballerina frozen, shells arranged in a neat line toward the window. The portrait of Elias Crow stared with the same disciplined absence. I set the ring on the table and felt foolish as soon as I did. The metal seemed to drink in light, making the room darker around it. I half expected it to clink or hum, but it was stubbornly mute. My hand hovered over it like an altar boy's. "Return it," Lila had told me earlier, voice small with fear. Return it before what? Before the river remembered? Before it came asking with teeth? When my fingers closed around the ring, the house breathed. It was a small thing at first. The candle on the mantel guttered though no draft reached it, and the shells trembled as if with a small, distant vibration. Then the music box picked itself up, and the tune that had been a whisper became a chant that wrapped like wet fingers around my throat. The parlor walls seemed to pulse, as if someone had set the house's ribs to the rhythm of a very old heart. In the window, the river's blink answered, one slow, patient flash. I slipped the ring back into the portrait's frame and pushed it toward the sill. For a moment, nothing happened, and the exquisite relief I felt was almost a laughable thing. Then the photograph shifted under my hand like a living thing. Elias Crow's eyes, painted, printed, fixed, seemed to fill with moving water. A sound that was not a sound came out from behind the glass, like a man clearing his throat after a deep sleep. Something moved in the room that was not whined. A shape unfolded near the fireplace, at first nothing more than a suggestion of damp clothing, then a man, or the idea of a man. Sodden coat, hair like seaweed, the hint of a grin that belonged to someone who knew the way tides kept promises. His eyes were not empty, they were patient and old, and they were looking at me the way a tide watches a shoreline, with inevitable appetite. "Elias," Lila breathed behind me, and her voice was a thing split between relief and terror. I should have run. I did not. I was useless with the kind of fear that makes your feet roots instead of wings. The figure stepped forward and the floor smelled like riverbed, mud and pennies and the thin metallic tang of old coins. When he spoke, his voice was the sound of water in a bottle, trapped and slow. "You found my promise," he said, and the word promise had the weight of a contract. You took it." Marcus said, voice loud in the small room where the music box still played as if compelled by machinery beyond human making. "You brought it back to the wrong house." Elias tilted his head. "They kept me in the house until the river learned the shape of me," he said. "They kept my ring so I could remember shore, but the river remembers names better than faces." He smiled, and it was not a smile that promised mercy. "You must leave it where it rests." "What do you want from me?" I asked, the question brittle. Elias gestured toward the window and then the river, the blink answering like a patient metronome. "The river prefers its own," he said. "It keeps things neat." Lila wept, quietly, the sound like a child trying to hush herself. "Is that why the house?" Her question broke off into the music. Then, like a tidal pull, everything shifted. The air became slender and cold. The photograph's image blurred into a smear of salt water. The ring, which I thought had been returned to its place, disappeared as if some hand had taken it cleanly in the dark. I felt a pressure against my ears, like being underwater, and for a stupid, breathless second the world rearranged into a place where gravity had forgotten how to behave. I woke up on the riverbank with my clothes damp and the taste of brackish water in my mouth. The Whitaker porch light was a dull coin far behind me. Above the bridge, the blink continued, steady as a heartbeat. My watch read 3:13. The thermos I had tucked under my arm earlier lay broken on the mud. In my palm there was a smear of green residue where the ring had been. My legs that had felt bolted with fear were cut and small with salt. I went home and locked every door I could think of. The town's sounds were too loud, the distant foghorn, a dog barking like a human calling for help, 2 cars that sounded like a far-off argument. When I closed my eyes, I could still see Elias in the parlor, patient as a creditor. When I slept, the lullaby threaded through the room and tugged at the edges of my mind. People began to look at me like I carried something contagious. Children crossed the street when they saw me with Lila. Pete stopped bringing me my usual at the bar. Instead, he left a beer on the counter and watched me like a man who hoped his faith in daylight might pull me back. Marcus avoided the river for a week, then confessed one night over cheap coffee that he'd seen things you can't unsee once you notice them. "It remembers," he said finally, "and it trades. You don't trade it things it forgot it owned." The town tightened like a fist. Windows were shuttered earlier. People kept their conversation to polite, quick sentences, as if the wrong word might open a sluice gate. Lila started leaving flowers on the Whitaker gate during the day and collecting old papers at night. I tried to help. Mostly I watched the river, waiting for it to do whatever it does when it collects what it believes to be its due. Sometimes in the small hours when the water blinks met the sky in a private conversation, I would hear the music box tune, and beneath it, as steady as a drum, the sound of someone counting down. I do not know what will happen when the count is finished. I only know that the ring was not a thing of metal, but a promise, and promises, once made, have a curious way of asking for payment. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. I kept a small, desperate journal after that night, the kind of notebook you buy at a harbor shop because it looks like it could hold tides. I told myself I would use it to sort the pieces. Ring, photograph, lullaby, Elias. I wrote names and times and sketched the parlor room as if lines on paper could pin down a thing that had learned to slip between words. Lila read over my shoulder and did not laugh. She put a steady hand on my arm and said, "If you disappear, Joel, I want to be the one who remembers you." We hunted records until the archive shelves smelled like the inside of a ship. Lila found deeds and a ledger, a battered account book from the Whitaker household dated before 1930. Someone had used it to track more than taxes. Names, dates, small payments, shorthand references to river dues. The handwriting was not one hand, but several, and in the margins someone had glued sea salt stiffened newspaper clippings. One entry, repeated and near the back like a refrain, read, "Returned, anchor, satisfied." Another scrawl, angry and later, said, "Not enough." "It reads like a list of favors traded for quiet," Lila murmured. "The Whitakers took in people when the docks were rough, fed them, kept them until there was less trouble for anyone else. In return, the river had a ledgers of its own." Her voice quivered in a way that made the paper tremble. Marcus, who had watched the river longer than most of us had been alive, brought salt and old rope and the kind of language a man uses when he knows storms. He told stories about how communities whisper to keep bargains, leave a bottle on the shore, tie a ribbon, keep someone's name as a candle for a debt. "They make tidy accounts down here," he said. "You can pay with goods, with memory, with promise. It likes tidy things." The ledger suggested the Whitakers had been trying to placate a slow-growing hunger. The house sheltered men who disappeared from the docks, set them up with jobs, then, in some hurried, polite way, let the river take its due. The ring, Lila suggested without saying the obvious, was not just trinket but talisman, an anchor of name and belonging that the river could use to call something back. I had taken it like a voyeur taking a photograph, thinking a snapshot could not change what it showed. If the river was a ledger and the ledger asked for balance, then my finding it had nudged the scale. The letter, the single ink-smudged warning, had been a tally. Return before it remembers. I had returned the ring and still woken on the bank with the taste of salt. The river had taken more than metal. It had taken a rhythm of my nights. The counting had begun. Lila and I argued about tactics. She wanted to bring everything back to the Whitaker porch and recite names from the ledger until the house had had its fill. Marcus said the river would only take what it chose and that bargaining was useless. Pete offered to gather men to stand on the bridge and shout names at the water at dawn. His bravado was paper thin. But his hands trembled when he made coffee for us that night. We did not trust the theater of shouting across broth-gray water. We needed something quieter. On the third night after the ring's disappearance, I found the ledger open to a page where someone had written in a steady hand a sentence that felt like a key. When the river is full of small things, offer something it cannot refuse. The line was followed by a name space left blank. Lila's pen hovered like a bird. We read it as intuition reads a map. Not certain, but the only way forward. I told them I would go to the river and offer up something that belonged to me. It was the kind of promise that sounds noble until you say it aloud and realize you have nothing else to bargain with. "Not your life," Marcus said immediately, eyes hard with the urge to protect. "Not your voice." I thought of voices lost to water and decided, for reasons that were part stubbornness and part fear, that voice was precisely the right thing to put on the balance. The river has an appetite for stories, for names tethered to objects. I had been hoarding my own, the smell of my mother's kitchen, the cadence of my laugh, the way my hands remembered the curve of a wrench. I stood at the bank with Lila and Marcus behind me, the Whitaker house a dark tooth on the skyline, the bridge blinking its slow answer. The ledger lay in Lila's hands like a talisman. She read the entry aloud as if speaking numbers aloud could settle a debt. I took the ring, again because ritual sometimes likes repeating, and slipped it onto my finger. The metal was same cold as when I had first touched it. It fit as if the ring had been waiting for the right thumb to close the loop. Then I opened my mouth to sing. Songs are small currencies. They are maps of who we are. I sang the lullaby the music box had taught me, the one that threaded through my sleep and my arteries, and then I began to tell my story. The names of my parents, the town where I grew up, the smell of my first apartment, the way Pete laughed when he thought he was alone. I spoke the names like offerings. Lila's voice trembled beside me when she added details she knew about me. The scar on my knee, the nickname she'd once called me when I'd fallen asleep in the archive. Marcus threw a length of rope into the dark water as if making a boundary. The river listened. That much I could say plainly. It leaned in with the long patience of water, and the blink answered the house like a slow pulse. I felt the river take one fact and then another, not plucking at the surface, but drawing whole shelves from a library I carried. The sound it made was not ugly. It was tidy, the exactness of a book being cataloged. When it took the sound of my voice last, the river left me with breath, but no echo. I stumbled away from the bank because the world had been altered by subtraction. The town still looked the same. The bridge blinked. The Whitaker porch light held its coin of glow. Pete's bar still hummed with low conversations. But when I tried to tell Lila the story the next morning, my mouth returned only half sentences and the taste of an absent memory. I could recall being there at the river in the dark and the sensation of something leaving. But the particulars, my father's face, the street names of my childhood, had been smudged as if someone had wiped an old map. Lila wrapped her arms around me then and told me things I had known and did not anymore. She recited the name Joel Whitman as if reading a relic. It fit like a label you'd sewn into the collar of a coat to remember who owned it. I trusted her voice to fill the gaps. Marcus grunted and swore softly that he'd seen the ledger close. Pete left a mug by my hand and did not ask for explanation. The river kept its bargain. The counting slowed. The blink over the bridge thinned into something like sleep. People in town unlatched their shutters a little sooner and began to speak of the Whitaker house in a softer voice, less willing to pry. Lila wrote an article about Elias Crow and the ledger and how towns carry debts. She kept the ledger in a box beneath the archive's oldest floorboard. She told me later that someone, perhaps a Whitaker descendant, perhaps the town itself, had begun to mark the accounts differently, leaving token offerings at the bank, a shoe, a coin, a small carved anchor. It was not a cure, it was an arrangement. I do not know how long I will remember this telling. I am reading from the journal because I want the record to exist, even if the river decides to tidy away more of me tomorrow. There are things I can feel and cannot name. The rusty taste that bursts when a memory is taken. The way a town becomes careful around a place that remembers too much. There are also things I have been given back. A face in the crowd that feels like family, though I cannot say whose it belongs to. A dog that licks my hand like forgiveness. If you ever come to Port Huron and you walk along the river near Elmwood, listen for the music box tune beneath the hum of the bridge. If you see a porch light that refuses to go out, do not dismiss it as mere decay. Sometimes places keep what we forget because they are good at remembering. Sometimes they ask for payment. I have paid a coin of voice and another kind of loss to the water. I can still see Elias Crow in my mind's last bright corner. Patient, not cruel, the kind of man who waits at the edge of stories until someone brings back what was borrowed. If I forget the way my father used to whistle, let Lila remember it for me. If I cannot tell my own origin, then carry it, town. Hide it in your ledger. Keep it in a photograph whose glass will fog in rain. There are bargains that save towns and erase individuals. I am both thankful and terrified of what I chose. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Thomas Grady. I was 32 years old when it happened, the night I still wake to in the small hours. The date was October 14th, 2018. People in Port Huron like to tell stories about the river, about the bridge, and the barges, and the lighthouse by Fort Gratiot that has stood longer than most families have lived here. I grew up on those stories. I learned the map of the town by the names my grandfather used. The riverfront, the old rail yard, the stretch of 7th Street where the lamps still burn yellow, even in fog. But nothing in the tales we traded at the docks prepared me for what I lived through, or for what I came to understand about the town when its old bones creaked at night. If you're going to tell a true haunted story, you start with the ordinary things: rent, work, the people you trust. I worked as a night custodian for the small museum that sat 2 blocks from where Fort Gratiot Light threw its long beam. The museum was a narrow place, a converted warehouse of brick and glass that showed the histories of boats and storms and the immigrant families who built the city. I liked that job. It put me in quiet rooms with cases full of objects that smelled faintly of oil and lemon polish. I liked how the city felt at night. Quieter, the streetlights stretched into ribbons on the river. I liked the lighthouse lanterns sweep like a slow, patient eye. My closest friends were people who had stayed in Port Huron for years. There was Lydia Flynn, who taught 4th grade and could make anyone laugh until they cried, and Marcus Doyle, who owned a hardware store and knew everything about every broken thing in town. Lydia and Marcus were the kinds of people who will go out with you at midnight and drive to the exact place you need to be, no questions asked. My landlord, an elderly woman named Mrs. Ellsworth, lived in the duplex above me and made pies in winter. None of them believed in anything supernatural. They believed in storms, in unpaid bills, in the church bake sale. They believed in Port Huron, simple as that. The museum had its own cast of quiet regulars. Old Mr. Brennan came most Thursdays to sit in the maritime wing and read the ledgers. He smelled like pipe tobacco and the flower of old newspapers. There was Claire, a graduate student who did archival work and always left her scarf on the same chair. Then there was the building itself, the bones of it, the ways the floorboards sighed, the iron stairs that held memory as if they were pockets. That building had already seen paint peel and roofs patched. It had been through floodwaters and a winter wind that had ripped shingles like paper. People said the place had spirit in it the way old trees have rings. You can see the years if you look closely. I should say something here about how Port Huron uses silence. The city at night is not empty. It hums with the past. Train whistles at 3 a.m, gulls arguing over a dumpster behind the fish shop, the far-off thrum of a freighter on the St. Clair. Those sounds become a sort of punctuation to our lives. You can live with that punctuation until one night the rhythm changes and you realize you have been reading the wrong chapter the whole time. That October, the weather had been a sneaky mix of fog and crisp air. The leaves had been clinging to the trees like held breath. I had been working late shifts, closing the museum and locking doors the way I always did. Check the northwest wing, verify the boilers were set, flick the security alarm on at 11:45. The night guards change over at midnight, and if everything is routine, you finish your coffee, exchange a shrug with the person on the desk, and go home. I had done that job for 3 years. My fingers knew the cold latch of the museum door when the key turned. But a month before the incident, something small had shifted. A case had been found open on a Monday morning. A model ship with its rigging askew, little bits of cotton where a label had been. No one could explain it. Claire swore she had seen the case closed when she left. Mr. Brennan said he hadn't been near it. The curator called it a prank. I called it the beginning of a string of nights I could not shake. There were other oddities. A whisper of footsteps when I was alone in the attic storeroom, a light that would be dimmer than when I had left it. Each oddity alone is forgettable. Together, they make a pattern like bird tracks across a yard. Over the next weeks, I began to notice other small things in the city at night. A boat tied to the marina that no one claimed, the radio station in the diner playing a song that seemed to be from another decade, and then stopping mid-verse. An anonymous note slipped under the museum door that said only, "You were here." I kept all of this from Lydia and Marcus at first. There is a particular vulnerability in admitting you are afraid of a place you used to find comforting. I did tell Mrs. Ellsworth about the note over tea, and she patted my hand and said, "People like to make stories out of dark things." She meant it kindly. She meant for me to be practical. My life ground on. I swept the museum floors, wiped the fingerprints from glass, took the late bus home. Friends asked me to come to the pub. I would go and sit by the window and watch the rain. And yet the feeling built, an accruing pressure at the base of the skull that I couldn't dismiss. I had grown up in Port Huron, and the town had never betrayed me. That very faith made whatever followed sting sharper. The night of October 14th began like any other late shift. I signed the closing log at 11:43 p.m., locked the east gallery, and turned off the main lights. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "You still working?" I told him yes, and in another text that I thought I need to take the longer way home tonight. He replied with a laughing emoji and, as a joke, "Don't let the lighthouse keep you." I laughed then too. I did not yet know how literal his words would feel. At around 12:15 a.m., standing by the back stairwell that led down to the service door and the river path, I heard something that wasn't part of the town's pattern. It was not the scraping of a boat, nor the soft, distant horn of a ship. It was a sound like a hand being run along the edge of a wine glass, high, wavering, and attuned to a pitch the city does not usually hold. I moved toward the sound without thinking, the way a person reaches for a glove left on a bench. That was when the main story began. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. I stepped toward the stairwell and the sound folded under my skin like cold water. It was coming from below, from the service corridor that ran along the river side of the museum, where the bricks smelled of mildew and old glue. The emergency exit light hummed, weak and yellow. My flashlight felt suddenly petty in my hand, its cone of light barely skimming the floor. The first thing I saw were the footprints. They were small and oddly spaced, like someone had walked on tiptoe. The dust on the concrete held them perfectly. Heel, ball, 3 short marks as if toes had been pinched. There were 5 prints, then none. They led from the corridor's dead end toward the door that opened on the river path. I traced them with my mind, trying to place size and weight and whether they'd been left by mud or something else. There was no mud, only a thin smear of salt and a faint line of something that gleamed under the beam. It looked like water, but when I knelt, the liquid didn't ripple. It was still, reflective. I felt the laugh settle in my throat, the kind you control because you are supposed to be the adult in a place of small absurdities. "Prank," I told the dark. Someone left footprints and went home. But the air in the corridor had gone wrong, thin, like straw. I had the sudden animal thought that one could drown on air. I pushed the service door open. The river smelled of iron and fish and the low, slow rot of leaves. Across the way, the marina was a black ribcage of masts. The lighthouse was a pale eye winking behind fog, and its sweep landed on me like a palm. On the river path, where the footbridge crossed the little inlet, there was a small boat tied oddly to a piling. I had never seen that boat before. It was a rowboat, paint flaked away to show the grain beneath, and inside it lay the outline of something, soft, folded, like a coat. As I walked closer, the beam of the lighthouse cut across the water and the thing in the boat raised its head. Its face was wrong, not because it wasn't human, it had the shape of a face, but because it looked like someone staring through a photograph. Flat, contrasty, with edges too sharp for the night. The eyes were black pits, like the ledgers of people in old photographs where ink bled into nothing. It smiled without moving its mouth. The sound that came out of me was not a sound at all, but a choking intake. "Hello?" I said. My voice landed on the river and came back broken. The figure didn't speak. It tilted its head in a manner that was polite and precisely not human. For a moment, I thought of Claire's grad student notes about memory objects, about how some things seem to hold the echo of what happened around them. The boat looked like one such object. Then the figure's hand rose, pale, webbed with the same reflective sheen as the liquid in the corridor, and pointed at me. I felt absurdly that pointing had a grammar. It meant, "You saw me." It meant, "You will be part of it now." I should have left then. The sensible thing would have been to go home, lock the door, and call someone who knew how to put things into categories. Instead, I sat on the piling and watched the thing row itself. It moved without oars, sliding along the water in a way that made small circles like a pebble confused under glass. The sound came again, the wine glass tone, and this time it layered a voice under it, old and patient, like someone humming to keep a child asleep. "You were here," the voice said. The same words as the note. I realized the voice was not coming from the figure, but from the boat itself, or from the river, or from inside my skull. It was the voice of the town's old stories, the one you hear when you are alone enough to listen. I walked backwards slowly, and the boat followed the line of the path as if it had a memory for geometry. When I reached the service door, I half turned and saw something else. On the museum's brick, written in the condensation from the river, a series of tiny handprints. Not muddy, clear as if someone had pressed the palms of a child to glass. The prints led upward like a ladder and stopped at the level of the attic windows where light never shone. I called Lydia that night. I left 3 messages, breathless and incoherent. "You won't believe. There's a boat. Don't laugh." She called back at dawn. Her answer was a steady voice and the smell of coffee. "Tom, you sound like you didn't sleep." She tried to joke it into being a hangover. Marcus told me to stop making ghost stories a habit. Mrs. Ellsworth gave me a slice of pie and said, "You see what you see, sweetheart." It was a kind, human triage that made me feel both ridiculous and dangerously exposed. Things got worse in a way that was not dramatic but cumulative. The radio in my kitchen started playing a sea shanty over and over at 2:12 a.m., always the same bar where the harmonies split and the singer began to weep. My dreams turned to wet wood and lanterns. I kept waking with my hands smelling like salt. On one night, I woke to the sound of someone or something sorting coins across my kitchen table. A careful, mortal noise. There were no coins when I switched the light on. There was instead a thin ring of salt on the tabletop, as if someone had measured the world and left a border. I told myself this was a nervous breakdown of the most New England sort, a slow erosion of sleep and sense. But then, a week after that night by the boat, Mr. Brennan did not show up at the museum on Thursday. He never missed. He lived 2 blocks away and was as punctual as a clock. When Lydia and I went to the building where he kept his papers, we found his apartment door slightly ajar. Inside, the small table where he read had been turned, and on the floor lay a single ledger page, edges glittering with salt, with one line written in his trembling hand. "Do not go near the water at night." He had underlined the words 3 times. The town began to look at me differently. Not unkindly, but with the private calculation people make when they don't know whether to lend you a hand or lock their doors. Sheriff Nolan stopped by once, gave me a look like someone balancing empathy and paperwork, and left with a promise that sounded like a dismissal. And yet, each step I took into the strange only drew me onward. I told myself I was looking for a pattern, a clue. Part of me, the stubborn kid who had once salvaged an abandoned radio from the junkyard and coaxed it into life, wanted to fix this, to name it. Whatever it was, whatever sat in the bow of that little boat and smiled through its face of photographs, it had chosen my patrol route, my shift, my name. That, more than fear, made me angry. I began to keep a notebook. In it, I wrote down times and sounds and all the little betrayals of night. The wine glass tone at 12:15, the rowboat at 12:23, the dream of the lantern, the salt rings. I taped one of the small footprints from the corridor into the back pocket. I slept with the door unlocked, not because I wanted to invite anything, but because the thought of barricades felt like surrender. On the 8th night, at 12:22 a.m., the lighthouse stopped its sweep. The beam held mid-arc, and the town went suddenly as silent as a picture. In that fixed light, the river's face went flat and mirror-like. From across the water, the shape in the boat looked up, and I could see, impossibly, the reflection of my own face in that blackness. It smiled. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The beam stayed frozen, like a held breath. For a long minute, the world seemed to have dissolved into the light. Gulls suspended mid-wing, the river a sheet of pewter, the boat an inky pinprick. Then, very softly, the hum started again, that same wine-glass tone, and this time it threaded through my ribs like a promise. I remember the exact smallness of my next choices, to stand and watch, to call for help, to run and never come back. I chose none of them. I walked along the path, the stones cold through my shoes, and the boat slipped toward me, as if the water were a track laid out just for it. At the last moment, a figure rose from the prow and stepped onto the dock without touching the planks. It moved like someone who has learned the geometry of absence. Its face, up close, was a collage of years. not altogether human, but threaded with the skin of people I had known. In its eyes, I saw the small ledger page from Mr. Brennan's apartment, the underlined words bending like prayer. It pointed again, slow and deliberate, at the place where my name had been carved in the wood of the dock when I was a boy on a dare. "You were here," it said, and my own voice echoed it back in a pitch that sounded nothing like mine. After that night, things rearranged themselves into what I can only call patterns. The town's ordinary compass broke. The lighthouse stopped only at odd hours. The diner clock refused to agree with my phone. A series of missing things accumulated like confetti. A child's shoe from the 1940s found its way inside the museum's maritime case. A faded postcard from a man named Elias Klein, a name I started to see everywhere, slid under the curator's office door. The postcard showed a boy at the head of a pier, smiling, and on the back someone had written, in a shaky hand, "Don't let the light lie." I would have laughed at myself if laughter had been possible. Instead, I took the postcard to Claire, and together we began the only kind of investigation that makes sense in a small town, talking to the oldest people and reading the oldest papers. Claire dove into the museum's boxes and pulled out brittle clippings and a ledger with a name that matched the postcard. Elias Klein, listed as lost to river on October 14th, 1918. The date prickled me. It matched the date that had been stitched into my memory, the anniversary now frayed and living inside my bones. We went to the library and turned pages until our fingers were smudged with dust. There, in a narrow column, a paragraph told the story of a boy who had loved the light and the boats, who had been last seen near Fort Gratiot, and whose body had never been recovered. The story spoke of a storm that had pushed fog into the mouth of the river, of lanterns lowered and then gone. At the bottom of the clipping, someone had written hastily, "He returns." The ink looked wet. The more I learned, the less town historians smiled. Marcus muttered about coincidences and about how humans are hardwired to find faces in clouds. Lydia brought me lemon cake and said nothing for a long time, and then, in the way people do when they try to make pain practical, she taught me to lock the doors and to leave a light on in the kitchen. It felt like advice you would give to a friend who had a leaky faucet. It did not touch the shape of what was coming. The figure became more than a single visitation. It sent things, tokens, not threats. A scrap of wet cloth tied to a lamppost in the shape of a child's handkerchief, a strip of rope coiled at the base of the museum stairs. Once, nailed to the bulletin board at the hardware store, was a tiny wooden boat with a single carved name, E. Klein. Whoever bore these offerings did it with an almost reverent calm, like a person arranging a shrine. One fog-heavy night, I decided to follow that calm. I told myself I was collecting evidence, that any brave person with a pulse and a notebook would do the same. I took the river path, the flashlight in my jacket pocket, the postcard burning like a coin in my hand. The water was glass. The lighthouse turned its beam with the slow indifference of machinery, and then, confusingly, it stopped again, directly on me. From the dark across the inlet came a song sung low and tuneless, a lullaby for people living at the edge of things. It pulled at the roots of memory, and it made my feet not mine. I heard it and walked. The bank under my boots felt like a stage built to someone else's plan. When I reached the last piling, the boat was waiting, black against black. The figure rose and offered me an oar. Not with threat, but with an invitation so precise it felt like a test of character. I knew in that small animal way that bodies understand danger before minds do, that taking the oar would change everything. I also knew that refusing felt like surrender to whatever had been carving into Port Huron for 100 years, so I reached out and took it. We moved across water that smelled like the inside of an old book. The oar pressed under my palms did not bend like wood, but like memory. Each stroke pulled a picture up from the riverbed. I saw Elias running along a dock, laughing. I saw a lantern tipping. I saw men and women with wet coats looking into the fog and finding nothing. The boat did not go far before the figure stopped and tilted its head. It pointed at the center of the river, where the light pooled like a wound, and when I looked down, I saw, under the thin surface, a shadow that was not a reflection. It twitched. I swore then and loudly, and the swearing didn't change the river's history. The figure's face softened into something mournful, almost grateful. It leaned forward and pressed its forehead to mine like an apology. A breath colder than ice moved between us, and with that breath came a whisper. "Bring him home." The whisper was not a request. It was a command that tasted like salt. We returned to the dock with the oar light as bone. The figure stepped out and became part of the night, folding itself into the fog in a way that took my breath with it. I stood on the planks, the oar in my hands, and felt the ledger page in my pocket. Mr. Brennan's handwriting, the underlined words. I realized then what the river wanted, what the town's silence had been protecting. Not malice, but hunger. Not of blood, in the way stories think, but of story itself. The river kept a ledger of loss, and it was always asking gently for an account to be balanced. The next morning, I found Marcus on my doorstep before dawn. His face was the color of someone who had been running. "You shouldn't have gone," he said, hands in his coat like anchors. He didn't ask what I had seen. He already knew. He had seen the lights on the river and had the sheriff's badge memory of how the town looks when its bones creak. Lydia arrived with coffee and a face that had chosen courage as its shape for the day. We had to decide then if we would answer the river or wait until it took something we could not live with. I felt the oar across my palm that morning like a promise and a burden both. I felt as if history had slipped a note into my hand and expected me to read it aloud. That night, the river came back to me in my dreams. I saw a boy reaching for a lantern and a man who could not catch him. I woke up crying, not for what had happened 100 years ago, but for what I could not yet prevent. When the town holds its breath, you learn to listen to the spaces between heartbeats. I listened, and the pause that answered me was full of water. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The morning after we decided to answer the river, the town moved like a body preparing for rain. People who had once shrugged at my stories brought casseroles and thermoses and wrapped their hands around them like small shields. Sheriff Nolan cleared his schedule with a look that said he didn't quite believe in ghost stories either, but he believed in people showing up when something was wrong. Marcus brought extra rope and a flare gun. Lydia packed sandwiches and a tin of lemon cake. Claire carried boxes of brittle clippings and the little wooden boat nailed to the hardware store board. Mrs. Ellsworth tied a handkerchief at my neck and told me, in the way old women do when they are making peace and fear both, if the water wants to talk, it knows my name. I didn't ask what that meant. We chose the night of October 14th. The date felt like a key. The ledger and the clippings and the little postcard all pointed the same way. The lighthouse's beam was steady that evening, its sweep more human than usual, like someone holding a candle to the shore. The river lay smooth as glass, and the town felt smaller, neighbors clustered like warm stones. Claire had found something in the museum boxes, a damp, folded shirt from a boy's size, with faint initials stitched into the hem, EK, and a scrap of child's handwriting reading in "Please don't forget me." It was the sort of thing you assume belongs in some forgotten trunk, not in the center of a living town's complaint. We wrapped the shirt and the carved boat in a blanket and took them to where my oar waited. We didn't go alone. Sheriff Nolan insisted on a small crew, and Marcus rowed like his life depended on steady hands. Lydia sat with the lantern, her face a map of concentration. Claire recited facts and dates in a low voice, as if scientific detail could anchor what we were about to do. I held the oar because the figure had given it to me, because it felt like a promise that would either steady or break me. The boat slid over the water without a sound. The lighthouse swept and then paused, and in that pause the river showed its other face. At the center, where the water pooled like a wound, shapes rose like memories. Hands, pale and reaching, a boy laughing with eyes like holes in an old photograph. I wanted to look away. Instead, I spoke Elias's name aloud, the name that had become a small consecration in my mouth. "Elias Klein," I said, "we're bringing you home." Something answered, and it was not a voice so much as a turn of the world. The water under us rose as if propelling a thing forward, and there was a glint, the side of a metal box caught in the river's throat. Marcus leaned and pulled, and, with the sheriff's help, we hauled up a small, rusted chest the size of a bread box. It was heavy with the smell of mud and old salt. When we pried it open with a pocket knife, the inside shone like a small cemetery. A child's marble, a button, a folded letter whose ink had run with tears decades older than any of us. The letter was short, the handwriting was shaky, but the heart behind the shaking was clear. It said simply, "I was afraid of the dark and meant to come back." It was signed in a small, tight hand, Elias. We carried the chest to shore as if it were a coffin. Word had run ahead of us. People lined the riverbank with lanterns. Mr. Brennan's niece and Mrs. Ellsworth and the few who had stayed in town for generations stood like a congregation. Lydia had arranged a place in the museum's maritime wing where the chest could rest. We wrapped the shirt and the carved boat around the box and left the oar across it like a marker. We held a small burial the next morning. It was not a funeral in the grand sense. There was no casket, no clergy from a cathedral, but there was grief that tasted like clean water. Sheriff Nolan read the ledger page that had been found in Brennan's apartment, and Claire read aloud the clipping about the 1918 fog. Marcus said a few words about how sometimes in Port Huron, the river keeps pieces of you until the town learns how to say your name properly. Lydia sang badly and with a force that made everyone laugh and then cry. They lowered the chest into the ground beside the old lighthouse keeper's plot, where masts and anchors were etched into stones. We buried Elias with the carved boat on top and a small plaque we had hammered together that read, "In memory of Elias Klein, who loved the light." The town had a way of making graves right, simple, honest, as if a proper place for sorrow could straighten a crooked world. After that, the anomalies eased. The lighthouse sweep returned to its steady, patient arc, and the beam no longer froze on any one person. The wineglass tone softened to something you could mistake for wind. The footprints in the museum corridor never reappeared. Mr. Brennan came back to his regular chair, though he never again sat there for more than an hour at a time. Perhaps because some pieces of worry never fully settle. Yet the river remembered in smaller ways. On certain foggy mornings, I would find a child's marble on the museum's stoop, or a scrap of cloth pinned to a bench where someone had been seen standing. Once, I woke to the sound of a single note tapped on glass and found, on my windowsill, a small wooden boat, not carved with a name, but smooth in a way that made the light pool around it. I kept it on my mantle as a talisman and a reminder that the world, even when it is cruel, can be negotiated with if you are willing to be practical, stubborn, and kind. People asked me later if the town felt different. In some ways, yes. There was an unspoken shift like the settling of a house after a storm, people more willing to leave lights on for a neighbor, to answer a knock in the night. Marcus's hardware store hung a tiny plaque over the register, for those who keep watch. Lydia started a weekly lantern walk for kids at the marina, teaching them how to whistle for help and where the safest ropes were tied. The museum put Elias's memento chest in an exhibit with a small sign explaining that sometimes history isn't just in books, it's in the acts of bringing someone home. Me, I kept working the night shifts. I locked the doors, I checked the boilers, and sometimes at 12:22 a.m., I would stand by the service door and listen. Most nights, the town hums its old, predictable songs. Occasionally, when the fog is coming in and the lighthouse seems to hesitate like a man considering a secret, I hear the faintest whisper of that wine-glass tone. It no longer cuts under my skin like cold water. It feels more like a reminder that the river keeps scores in its own way, that the past does not entirely die if it does not first get remembered, and that people, even stubborn ones, must sometimes negotiate with the things they don't understand. I've learned to live with that negotiation. The oar is still in my closet. I take it down sometimes and run my hand along the smooth, worn wood. It is a thing that belonged to the night and stayed human. It is a thing that taught me how to answer. When people ask if I'm still afraid, I tell them yes, and I tell them no. Fear is not the same as forgetting. You can be afraid of the dark and still be brave enough to walk into it with a light and a friend and an oar. Port Huron keeps its boatyards and its bars, its fishermen and its grieving people. It keeps its stories too, some of them hard and sharp, some like driftwood you can make into a shelter. If you come to the river on a quiet October night and the lighthouse pauses for a moment, don't be afraid to speak a name. Sometimes that is all it takes to set a thing right. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Thomas Whitaker. I was 28 years old when it happened, October 13, 2016. If you know Port Huron, you know the river first. The St. Clair carrying the cold metallic smell of the lake between its banks, the Blue Water Bridge glinting like a finger across to Canada, the lighthouse on a spit of rock that keeps its own company. I can tell you the exact street my aunt's old Victorian sat on, a crooked little lane that used to be respectable before factories closed. But what matters is how a town like that holds on to its past. It's the kind of place where every house has a backstory, and every backstory has a shadow. Before I tell you what happened, let me tell you who I was then. I worked nights at the Port Huron terminal, small freighters, tugs, paperwork that never seemed finished. Weekends I'd play guitar at a bar on Water Street, and my girlfriend, Lucy Monroe, taught first grade down by Woodrow School. My best friend Sam Bishop drove the towboats. He'd been on the river since he could walk. People in town called me steady. I liked that. I liked being steady until the ground under me slipped. My aunt, Edith Crow, had been a fixture in Port Huron. No relation by blood, she was my mother's school friend who left a life in Toledo for quiet winters and stubborn summers by the lake. When she died, she left me the house right on the edge of West Port Huron, a Victorian with gingerbread trim and windows like old theater eyes. Not a fortune, but enough to make me move in instead of renting. It sat 2 blocks from the light and 3 from the pier. From the upstairs windows, you could see the dark sweep of water and lights blinking on the bridge at night. The house came with more than curtains and a stubborn boiler. Edith had been, to put it mildly, a pack rat of memories. Newspaper clippings, a trunk of letters, and a faded photograph album that smelled like camphor. Among those papers was a pressed program from a memorial service dated 1898 and a hand-scrawled note warning, "Mind the third stair. It remembers." Old towns like Port Huron accumulate warnings like barnacles. I laughed at it, of course. You would have. I was a practical man. I patched a hole in the porch roof myself and took boxes to Lucy's spare room. The more practical I was, the less I wanted to admit the town's stories had a way of pressing themselves into you. Port Huron has superstitions, as all river towns do. The fishermen talk of a light on foggy nights that shouldn't be there, and of fairies that hum with voices when the foghorns blow. The older folks told me about the mill down by Pine Road, a red brick ruin where a fire took a dozen souls in 1912, and how, on certain evenings, you'll see a heat wave of blue where the windows are gone and think you smell the smoke. Reverend Alston, who married me and Lucy on a wet August afternoon, told me once over a plate of church potluck pie that certain places hold on to people the way a bruise holds on to color. He didn't mean hauntings as much as memory. Still, he crossed himself when he walked past the mill. People like me believe in practical explanations. The creak of old beams is the house settling. Drafts explain cold spots. Grief explains the sighting of a figure on the pier who vanishes when you walk down to shake their hand. But there was a darker current of rumor, a story that wound through the town like ivy. A boy who had once vanished from the lighthouse keeper's cottage in 1904, a child carried away by the fog or something else, people disagreeing. The photo album in my aunt's trunk had a picture of a little boy holding a toy boat, face smudged, and a note, "For those who listen at night." I thought it was an enchantment of sentiment. Later, I learned to mistrust nearly everything I thought I knew. Before that October, I told Lucy I'd take the attic down to make space for a studio. She rolled her eyes and said she'd help if I bought pizza. We were young, practical, regular people. Sam joked that moving into an old house was a chest of free adventure. No one thought to mention that the house had been empty for a long time before Aunt Edith moved in. No one pointed out the odd repairs Edith had never finished. I suppose grief muffles the rest of the world. Inheriting a place from someone you loved can feel like the easiest thing, a duty done by turning a key. There were signs, little ones at first. A picture frame hung crooked when I'd left it straight, the radio set to static at 3 a.m, though I'd turned it off. A smell like wet wool that lingered on the second floor some nights. I blamed the animals that sometimes nest under the porch. I blamed humidity and my own tiredness at the marina. The town was full of helpful explanations if you needed them. Sam, who came over to move a bookshelf the weekend I moved in, said, She had a life, Tom. Folks like Edith collect things that keep company. You'll be fine. Make some soup. Put in a pot of coffee and don't be an idiot. Edith had been anything but idiotic. She'd been sharp as a tack and solitary, inviting no one to stay the night, though neighbors said they'd tried. Her letters were full of small, startling entries. "Don't answer the tapping," one note read in cramped blue ink. "If you go down at midnight, carry nothing but light." Warnings, again. I folded the papers into a drawer and told myself that keeping them was enough reverence. People keep warnings in drawers. They don't always follow them. I promised Lucy I'd be careful. I promised Sam I'd let him know if anything weird happened. I kept those promises because they were small and reasonable. And for a long while, the house was merely old and polite. It complained in the wind but offered shelter. I learned the rhythm of the stairs and the squeal on the third step, and half-joked about Edith's eccentricities at dinner parties. But there was an undercurrent, a patience in the house, that felt like someone waiting for me to notice. And then, on that rainy October night, the night I will not stop revisiting, the ordinary gave way to something that demanded attention. The clocks had all just chimed 10 when the tapping began. This is where the story truly starts. The tapping was soft at first, like the careful knock of a neighbor with news. It came from under the stairwell. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks again, measured, as if the wood itself had learned a code. I told myself it was a branch, a raccoon, the storm testing the eaves. But when I opened the door to the basement and the air pressed a cold, clean breath against my face that smelled of river water and long dead leaves, I felt the hairs on my arms lift in a way no draft had ever caused. The light I carried skittered across the cement floor and stopped on a small, wet print that did not match my boots. It led toward the coal bin, and then it stopped as if whatever had left it had noticed me watching and decided to be careful. I should have called Sam. I should have called Lucy. I did neither. I reached for the coal bin handle, and the story that had been waiting, patient as rot, unfolded into a voice that sounded like a child reciting the names of the dead. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. The voice kept saying a name. Eben. 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 It was thin, rolling like a pebble down a stairwell, and it filled the corners of the house the way cold fills a glass. I remember thinking at the time that names are small and heavy things. You can throw one away like a match, or you can set fire to a town with it. I slept poorly after that night. Poorly is a kind way of putting it. I slept as if the bed itself worried at me, like a thing that had been used and then sewn shut wrong. The dream that followed wasn't a dream so much as a memory slid into my head without permission. A boy with hair the color of river reeds, a toy boat with a name carved on its hull, and a hand reaching from water that was too dark to be only water. When I woke, the sunlight through the curtains looked anxious, as if it had been up all night listening. Lucy found me that morning at the kitchen table with Edith's photo album spread like opened palms. She frowned at the picture of the child, the same one in the album, the one with the smudged face and the toy boat, and then at the note in the margin. For those who listen at night. She touched the photograph and said softly, "Tom, this is weird." She always uses the word weird when she doesn't have a better one. It felt safer than scary, which would have been fairer. Sam came by that evening, hauling a bag of tools and his habitual skepticism. He smoked 2 cigarettes on the porch before he would look me in the eye and ask what I hadn't told him yet. When I told him about the taps and the footprint and the voice, he laughed the first time. His laugh is a thing that can steady a room. But even Sam's laugh felt thin that night. He ran his hand along the 3rd stair, listened, and then frowned. "She did say mind that stair," he said, and his voice had the hollow sound of someone reading a line from a script that used to be a scapegoat. He stayed until midnight, and when the tapping started again, he said he would sleep on the couch and keep the light on. It wasn't only noise. The house began to claim pieces of my life, the way water claims smooth stones, not violently, just inexorably. I'd set my guitar down and find it tuned wrong despite not touching it. A shirt I left on a chair would appear folded on the bed. The radio that we'd used at the bar on Water Street, the one I hadn't plugged in since moving, would come on to static at 3 in the morning and play, for a moment, a melody that sounded like someone humming under their breath while counting. Then there were moments beyond explanation. I woke up once standing in the middle of the pier, the hardwood cold through my slippers, though I'd gone to bed in the house and could not recall walking there. The river smelled like pennies and old rope. There was a small boat beached near the piling, the kind of toy boat you'd see in the photo, and in the wet sand someone had scratched a name. Ibn. My hands smelled of coal and of something older, like the inside of a closed book. Lucy found me there, more frightened than I'd ever seen her outside of the emergency room after she fell while hiking. She touched my face like she was checking a fever. "Tom," she whispered, "you're not well." We started asking around town. That's the thing about small places, they have records and grudges both. Reverend Alston was cautious and kind. He offered prayers but not judgments. "Some spirits," he said, "are like unattended fires. You might put damp on the embers, but you must find the source." Mrs. Winton at the library pulled an old ledger for me and pointed to a list of names in a brittle columned page. Under October 1904, a single entry read, "Lockwood child, missing, presumed drowned." There was no ribbon of obituary headlines, just a small, bark-like note from a clerk who had lived before my aunt. We learned the boy's name properly then, Eben Lockwood, 6 years old when he vanished. His father, Elias Lockwood, listed as the lighthouse keeper, had a sad, severe face in a portrait that looked like it had been taken in the weight of winter. The paper beside Elias's name noted a letter in which he accused strangers of visiting the river at night, and the clerk had penciled in a remark from a coroner that suggested the child's disappearance had been blotted out with drink and grief more than with discovery. People in town had said the lighthouse hummed on foggy nights, and now it seemed less like a romantic thought and more like a detail with teeth. Edith's notes, I realized, were not mere eccentricities. The warning, "Don't answer the tapping," that once seemed quaint, now sat in my mind like a key I'd left in a lock. Lucy kept pressing me to move out, to rent, to be practical. I kept saying no, because leaving felt like losing something important. A duty to the woman who had trusted me with her house, perhaps, or just stubborn masculinity refusing to admit fear. Sam offered to bring in a priest if it came to that. Reverend Alston's suggested a blessing. Mrs. Winton recommended we play recordings of a child's laughter to hear whether the house responded. People tried to be helpful in the small ways towns know how. On a Wednesday evening, a week after the tapping began in earnest, I confronted the thing. I stood on the landing with the coal bin lid under my hand and said aloud, "Eben, if that's your name, I hear you. What do you want?" The silence that followed was a living, patient thing. Then, like a gust through a gap in a door, it answered. "Home," the voice said. Not a word exactly, but a feeling shaped into one. The house shifted as if to agree. The old floorboards sang. I thought of Elias Lockwood at the lighthouse, a man who looked like he'd been carved from rope, and decided then that grief breeds a kind of architecture. Rooms built to hold the absence of the ones you love. That night the tapping changed. It was no longer a code at the stairwell, but a wet, slow knocking that traced the pattern of my name along the skirting boards. When I tried to follow it, the sound moved away, and then reappeared at the window facing the river, where the light from the Blue Water Bridge slid like a ruler across the glass. I could hear breathing, but it wasn't mine. I don't know when exactly I began to fear, not for my life, though sometimes I did, but for the sense of home that other people have. What frightened me most was the way the house wanted to keep me, as if I had become a piece of furniture it admired. I wanted to leave and protect Lucy and Sam from whatever patience lived in those walls, but part of me wanted to stay and ask more questions, to listen until the voice told me the name of the thing that had taken Eben. That's the slow corruption of curiosity. It makes you a detective and sometimes a victim. We planned then, more like hoped than planned, to go to the lighthouse. Reverend Alston said he would come. Sam insisted on bringing a lantern and a rope. Lucy, with a face set in a stubborn line, said she would drive. The town would have looked at us then, a trio of stubborn moderns and an old pastor setting out at dusk to an old lighthouse that kept its secrets like a safe. We were going to test whether the river simply kept its dead or whether something else had kept Eben all those years. Outside, the fog rolled in as if it had been waiting for an invitation. The bridge lights dimmed behind a veil. The river sighed. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. We drove to the lighthouse with the fog swallowing the world as if the sky had folded down to meet the river. Reverend Alston murmured a prayer under his breath like a map. Sam's hands were white around the steering wheel, and Lucy kept peering out the windshield as if she could will the fog to lift. The lighthouse looked like a stub of bone in that gray, its paint gone to the color of old teeth. The path down to the shore was slick with river salt and the kind of moss that sticks to boots and conversations. The thing about lighthouses is that they teach you how to listen. They stand where people get lost and send back warnings in light. This one had been a warning for a long time, and the town had learned to ignore some of its flickers. We crossed the threshold and the air changed, colder by a degree that felt personal. My breath fogged the lantern flame, and the sound of the river was reduced to a constant, distant low, like a sleeping animal. Inside, it smelled of brine and old rope. Lanterns hung from rusted hooks like forgotten moons. On a narrow shelf, we found objects: a child's thimble, a lace scrap, a small carved boat with the paint all but gone. When Sam picked up the boat, his hand trembled. The name on the hull was faint but there. Eben, carved with a blunt nail. The wood was pitted and water smooth where hands had held it. Reverend Alston made a motion as if to cross himself, and the three of us looked at one another, the way people do when the map has a red X they can no longer deny. We asked questions. The lighthouse keeper's log was bound in a leather that had the smell of river mud. Elias Lockwood's entries were terse, then erratic, long silences punctuated by nights of frantic notation. Fog, lights strange. Child restless, heard tapping under stairs at 3 a.m. Boat missing. The final entry, written in a hand shaking as if cold or terrified, said only, "He went to the river. I could not hold him." The page smeared there as if someone had tried to write and been washed away mid-sentence. Lucy's face went pale reading that. She closed the book gently like a woman who knows how fragile certain things are. "He blamed himself," she said. "He never forgave himself." It was a practical thing to say, but it felt right. Grief does not always make monsters. Often it makes confessionals that stay open. We took the boat, Sam insisted. He'd driven those waters in storm and calm. The oars slapped rhythm into the quiet. The fog wrapped us like wool. The bridge lights were scales of color without bodies. As we drifted, Reverend Alston began to speak a prayer that sounded like an unspooling rope, steady and patient. The river took the sound and flattened it. For a moment, I felt like a man between two clotheslines, caught by what had been pegged there long ago. Then the river changed. It became a mouth of glass. The oars hit a patch of water that felt wrong under the blades, as if the river had turned its skin inside out. A pressure rose from the deep, not violent, not quick, but like a hand pressing slowly against the back of your head until you notice your pulse. The lantern in the stern guttered, though there was no wind. "Eben," I said, because by then the name was a kind of prayer in a brick. "Eben, is that you?" The water answered with a child's breath. It rose and fell against the hull like someone testing the sides of a tub. From the fog, a sound came, not quite a voice. It was a laugh and a sob folded together, the way old songs sometimes hold two notes at once. Then, out of the mist, a small figure appeared, not in body so much as suggestion, a smudge of a boy in the way a watercolor washes back into the paper when it's wet. He stood on the water like a thing that had learned to walk on glass. Sam moved before I could think. He reached for the boy and the boat that lay at his feet, but as his hands neared, the boy slipped like a reflection into the depth, and the boat sank, leaving a dry, clean ring in the fog where it had been. The rope Sam had tied round his stubborn, modern rope of safety went taut, and for a heartbeat I thought he was going over. The oar clattered. Lucy screamed my name and caught his shoulder with a grip that sounded like faith. He did not go. The rope held. Sam fell back into the boat, breathless and pale as sea foam. The Reverend, who had kept his hand on the rosary, muttered, "It knows our measures," as if that explained anything. I sat there, knuckles white on the lantern, the cold seeping up through the soles of my boots like memory. We rowed back with the boat heavier than it should have been, as if the river had put a small, invisible weight on our stern to remind us it could. At the shore, Lucy wanted to run. Reverend Alston wanted to stay to pray. Sam wanted to find the bay where the toy sank and dig until his hands bled. I wanted answers and the simplest of all things, to take the toy home, to put it on a shelf, to prove that what had been missing could be retrieved. What we did instead was take the carved boat from the lighthouse shelf and bring it back to my aunt's house. It felt wrong to move anything from the lighthouse, to take a keepsake from a place of mourning, but the house had called me, and I am a man who answers his house. Maybe that's how the thing maintained its hunger, give it a place to remember from. After that night, the house changed. Not the creaks you can explain, those remained, but the way it drew its breath with me. The tapping returned, but now with variety. A softer, impatient rhythm that threaded through the walls like a runner's pulse. Each knock seemed to say not just home, but remember. I began finding prints on the stairs again, small and wet, as if a child had run through the house and left the river with him on his soles. If I stood very still, I could hear the echo of a lullaby heard through a threadbare wall. The kind of song a father hums until his voice frays. We tried rituals. The Reverend held a blessing in the parlor. His words smudged the air but did not lift the fog from the windows. Sam, practical and furious, sprinkled salt in the corners and then swore because the salt drew a line of damp that would not dry. Lucy brought in toys from her students, small plastic boats and oars, and set them on the windowsill. She said if a child's presence was the problem, maybe community, repeated and steady, could soothe it. For a while, it helped. At night, sometimes the tapping would ease, like a throat clearing, and I would sleep with my hand on the Bible Aunt Edith used to keep under her mattress. But the river had deeper patience. One night, months after the first tapping, I woke to the sound of someone singing. It was Eben's voice, or the memory of it, high as a pocket watch and bright as a coin. It came from the attic, where Edith had kept her trunks. I climbed the stairs and found, tucked between quilts, the toy boat we had retrieved from the lighthouse. It sat in the open trunk like a promise, the name Eben plain on its side, its hull dry though the fabric around it smelled of river. Before I could think to be afraid, the attic spoke the one word that unstitched me. Daddy, the voice said, small and certain. The rest of the house listened. The world outside felt very far away. Reverend Alston's prayers, Sam's tools, Lucy's good sense, my steady hands. None of them reached the place inside that called itself home to a boy who had learned the river's quiet. There was something else there, a current of blame that twisted time. The way a child's absence can make an entire life fold inward upon itself until it can be mistaken for something else. I don't know yet if what we did next helped the boy or the town. I only knew then that the name we had dredged from ledger and photograph and water had meaning beyond an obituary. It was a hinge. And once hinges begin to move, doors open. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. When the attic said Daddy, I knew then that this was less a haunting and more a pleading. Not for vengeance, but for confession. The river does not only take, sometimes it keeps the part that cannot forgive. For weeks after that word, the house let me sleep in fits and starts, and each morning tasted like an unanswered question. I read the ledger until my eyes watered. I read Edith's notes until the margins blurred. There were scraps of a life in that attic. A boy's sock folded into a napkin, a newspaper clipping about a storm, a hand-drawn map that marked a curve in the river with a small X in the corner. All of it pointed to the same thing. The night Eben disappeared wasn't a ghost story passed down for fun. It was a wound everyone in Port Huron had learned to avoid looking at. Reverend Alston told me there are different kinds of forgiveness, the kind you offer and the kind that needs to be asked for. He suggested that sometimes the living must do both, ask and offer, because spirits, if they are tethered to grief rather than malice, respond to being seen. Sam, who had refused to be merely practical about the whole thing since he'd nearly fallen in the boat, started sleeping with the lantern by his bed and showing up at my place at odd hours. Lucy cleaned the house like someone clearing a room for the first time after a funeral. She set out cups of tea and left a child's scrap of blue ribbon on the windowsill by the river-facing window. We planned what felt then like a very human thing, a return. Not an exorcism and not a provocation, but a ceremony of sorts. A way to give back what had been found and to ask the town to remember properly. We agreed to go on the night of October 13th, the date in the ledger. It was the anniversary of the disappearance, and the date had been written in many hands across Edith's papers, as if that day had been a bruise the town pressed at, over and over. Reverend Alston drove with us to the lighthouse and carried a small leather book of prayers. Sam brought the lanterns and rope, supple, modern rope, and Lucy packed a thermos of coffee and a small bouquet she'd made of wild asters. I took the carved boat we'd found and kept in the attic, and a photograph from Aunt Edith's album that showed the child with the toy in his hand. I held it like a thing that might break if I breathed too hard. The fog that night was different. It sat in the river like a secret that had been waiting for permission to come out. When we stepped onto the rock where the lighthouse stands, the air seemed to narrow, as if the world were listening in. Reverend Alston prayed under his breath, not loudly, because loudness would have felt like a show in a place that deserved honesty. I set the photograph and the boat on a flat stone and waited while the lanterns painted halos into the mist. I said what I'd never said aloud to anything other than Lucy and Sam. Eben Lockwood. I'm Thomas Whitaker. I lived in the house for your aunt. I am sorry I didn't see you sooner. The words felt ridiculous and clumsy, and perhaps they were, but there is a sort of bluntness and humility that can make a wound stop widening. Reverend Alston read a prayer about mercy and small lights. Sam laid a hand on my shoulder in a way that said nothing mean to me at all. Then we did the simplest, oldest thing. We gave back. I set the carved boat into the tide pool at the foot of the light and let the water take it slowly. It did not sink like a stone. It eased under like a thing going to sleep. As it moved away, the river made a sound like a small bell. I thought I saw, at the edge of the lantern's reach, the figure of a boy step off the water and then become a suggestion of a smile. It might have been the fog rearranging itself into human kindness. It might have been Eben. For a suspended moment, whatever grief had held him learnt, perhaps, that he was being seen. The next day, something at the house changed. The tapping did return on occasion, but it was different, softer, like someone knocking to be let in rather than to be admitted as a tenant. The prints on the stairs appeared less often and dried quickly, as if the river had decided to visit and move on. Lucy slept without waking, and for a while the radio stayed where we left it. The attic, which had felt like an old sore, became merely another room with trunks and stale linens. I could live with the knowledge that memory remains. That's the point of human houses, to keep things that matter. But closure was not a single night. Grief in a town is a traffic pattern. People pass it in the way they pass the bridge. Some folks in Port Huron still flinch down by the river at dusk. Old men who remembered Elias Lockwood would cross themselves and say, "God rest him," not because they believed in ghosts necessarily, but because the cost of being human is to carry what you cannot fix. We invited the town to the lighthouse for a small service, and a dozen people showed, carrying candles and small wooden boats of their own. We placed them on the water like paper boats at a parade, and for a brief, electric hour, the river looked like a line of lanterns marching toward repair. I will not say all was healed. The house still remembered Aunt Edith. Sometimes I'd find her note folded into a pocket of the quilt, and feel the echo of a woman who had spoken in warnings because she was afraid and loved. Once, late in the winter, when the river had gone to a steely still, I woke to the sound of a soft humming below me, a melody that could have been a bedtime song or only the wind through the eaves. It didn't frighten me then. It was an old thing in new clothes, like a song remembered and not mourned. What the experience taught me, and this I tell plainly because it is the heart of what folks whisper about in Port Huron when the storm is on the horizon, is that sometimes the living must do the work the dead cannot do. To keep telling the truth until the tale no longer gnaws bone, to put back what has been lost, even if what you return is only a small carved boat or a name read aloud into the dark. Sometimes you stand at the water and hand it your regret, and it hands you back a measure of peace. Sam took to checking the pier in the mornings, and Lucy later moved into a house that smelled less of old paper and more of coffee. She liked that. But she still came by with students, bringing them to the lighthouse on field trips to teach them about ship safety and the history of our river. Reverend Alston grew older and softer around the edges. I kept the house. It cost me nights of listening, yes, but it also kept me rooted to stories I might otherwise have walked away from. When the first winter storm hit after the boat went back, the house groaned and settled and then, like a tired person finally allowed to sleep, quieted. On quiet evenings, I sometimes stand at the upstairs window and watch the blue water bridge blink. If the fog is thin and the river calm, I swear I can see, across the black, a tiny shape step lightly on the water for a moment and then fade. I do not pounce on it. I do not claim it as proof. I only press my palm to the glass and feel the old house breathe with me. There are things we will not fully understand. There are things that have to be honored instead of conquered. So this is the end, as stories go. Not a grand victory or a vanishing exorcism, but a quiet return. Eben's name no longer scrapes my tongue raw when I speak it. It now sits like a stone you can pick up and hold in your pocket. Real and weighty and part of the world, not an accusation anymore, but a memory kept. The house forgot being a claimant and remembered being a home again. Hit subscribe for more chilling tales. This story is over. Get ready for the next one.